Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, here to share scary stories to fall asleep to. This is a black screen video with no ads or interruptions. Just you, the rain, and tonight's show of eerie tales. Relax, and let the sound of rain help you drift off as the scary stories unfold. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a fascination, and I'm grateful to hear from you. Remember to like and subscribe, since there will be no breaks. Let's begin our journey into the shadows together. So I guess if I'm really going to tell you this, I have to start with Ridgevale. Ridgevale's not the kind of place people ever hear about unless they're unlucky enough to drive through. It's just one of those small towns that exist on the edge of nowhere, slowly falling apart without anyone noticing. You know the type. Crumbling gas stations, a couple of diners that look like they haven't been updated since the 70s, and a main street where half the shops are boarded up. No one ever really leaves Ridgevale, except me, I guess. I got out after high school, went to college, didn't look back. I wasn't one of those people who romanticized small town life, you know? My dad, on the other hand, well, he never left. He was the kind of guy who was content with sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, and watching the world pass by without him. We didn't talk much after I left, but I guess we didn't really talk much when I lived there either. When he died, I wasn't exactly itching to come back. But you know, someone had to handle his affairs. The house was still there, gathering dust, waiting for someone to clear it out. So, yeah, that's how I ended up back in Ridgevale after so many years, staring at the house I grew up in, trying to remember if I'd ever really liked living there. It was late when I got into town, and it had started raining, of course. Not a heavy storm or anything dramatic like that, just this steady drizzle that soaked everything through. Ridgevale's like that. Always raining when it's inconvenient. So, after I dropped my bags at the house, I thought I should head up to Old Hallow Cemetery. You know, do the respectful thing, visit my dad's grave, all that. The cemetery sits up on this hill that overlooks the town like it's keeping an eye on things, which honestly always creeped me out as a kid. There's something about the way the graves line up, row after row, just sitting there in silence. But I wasn't a kid anymore, so I told myself to stop being an idiot and just go pay my respects. By the time I got there, the rain had picked up a little, making everything slick and muddy. I had this stupid idea that I'd be able to find his grave easily. But it turns out when you've been gone as long as I have, the cemetery changes. Graves pop up you don't remember. And headstones you think you know look different, older. It took me a while to find my dad's spot. And by the time I did, I was drenched. That's when I saw it. The grave next to my dad's wasn't right. I don't know how else to explain it. The dirt around it was all messed up, like it had been dug up and then half filled back in. There were weird marks on the headstone, like scratches or something, but not from animals, at least not any animal I'd ever seen. I figured maybe it was just bad maintenance, you know? Maybe the ground was shifting or whatever. I didn't think too much about it at first. As I stood there in the rain, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was settling in, I heard footsteps. Now I know what you're thinking, but I wasn't alone. The cemetery's caretaker, Bill Harriman, was making his rounds, holding this old-fashioned lantern like something out of a horror movie. Bill was the type of guy who always looked like he belonged in Ridgevale. He never seemed to leave the cemetery, just shuffled between the graves like they were old friends. He didn't say much when he saw me, just gave me this weird look like he knew something I didn't. I asked him about the messed up grave, you know, trying to make conversation, but Bill just shrugged and mumbled something about the ground not wanting to keep things buried. Yeah, real comforting. Anyway, I figured it was just Bill being Bill, so I didn't push him on it. But as I stood there, watching him shuffle off between the rows of gravestones, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I don't know why, but there was this nagging thought in the back of my head, like a voice whispering that I should be paying more attention. I stood by my dad's grave for a little longer, rain dripping off my coat, and stared at that disturbed patch of earth. The scratches on the headstone, the way the dirt seemed like it had been pushed from underneath, not above. It was late. The rain was picking up, and I told myself I was being stupid, letting old memories and too much time away mess with my head. So I turned around and left. But that image stuck with me, you know? That grave, with the earth looking like it didn't want to stay still. It would have been easier if I could have just let it go, but I couldn't. I didn't sleep much that night. Not that I expected to. Sleeping in my dad's old house felt like staying in a stranger's place. Everything was dusty, like no one had touched it in years, even though he'd only been gone a few weeks. The rain hadn't let up either, so all I could hear was the steady tapping on the windows. If you've never been back to your childhood home after years of staying away, let me tell you, it's weird. You remember it one way, but when you get there, nothing feels the same, like the house moved on without you. Anyway, I couldn't stop thinking about the cemetery, about that messed up grave. You ever have one of those things you can't shake, no matter how hard you try? This was like that. The more I told myself to stop obsessing over it, the more it stuck in my head. It's not like I wanted to care, but something about the way Bill shrugged it off didn't sit right. And the rain wasn't helping either. It kept coming down in that annoying, constant drizzle, making everything feel damp and heavy. Perfect weather for digging up old thoughts, I guess. The next day, I went into town to grab some coffee and try to get a feel for what had changed since I left. Turns out, not much. Ridgevale was still the same dying town I remembered. Same. Empty storefronts, same groups of old guys sitting outside the diner, talking about God knows what. It was like time had just kind of stopped. Even the coffee shop looked like it hadn't upgraded since the 90s. But I wasn't there for nostalgia, I wanted answers. So I asked around a bit, brought up the cemetery in casual conversation. That's when things got weird. The second I mentioned Old Hallow, people clammed up. No one wanted to talk about it. I swear, every time I asked, I got the same look, like I'd said something I wasn't supposed to, and not in a ghost stories around the campfire kind of way. It was more like people didn't want to remember the place. That's when I started noticing something. People weren't just avoiding talking about the cemetery, they were avoiding the cemetery itself. You could see it in the way they acted. Like the cemetery's right there on the hill, but no one ever looked in that direction. It was like Old Hallow didn't exist to them anymore. Except for one guy, this old-timer named Earl. I used to see him around when I was a kid, but now he looked like he was about 2 steps away from meeting the graves himself. I caught him sitting outside the diner, looking at me like he knew I was going to come over. So, I did. I figured, what the hell, maybe he could shed some light on what was going on. When I brought up the cemetery, Earl gave me this half smile, kind of like he was humoring me, and said, "That place hasn't kept anything buried right for years." Well, that got my attention. I pressed him a little more, asked what he meant. He took a sip of his coffee, black, because of course it was, and leaned in like he was about to tell me something important. "You notice how people don't go up there no more?" he asked. I nodded. "Well, they got their reasons," he said, real casual-like. "Sometimes the ground don't like what's put in it. Pushes it right back out." Okay, now I wasn't just curious, I was getting a little freaked out. I asked him if he was messing with me, but he just laughed, this raspy old man laugh that made my skin crawl. "Ask Bill," he said. "He's been up there long enough, he knows." I didn't have much to say to that, so I thanked him and walked away, feeling like I'd stepped into something way bigger than I understood. Part of me wanted to just leave it alone. Go back to the house, pack up my dad's stuff, and get the hell out of Ridgevale. But another part of me, well, let's just say curiosity's always been a problem for me. Later that evening, the rain finally let up a bit, and I found myself driving back up to Old Hallow. I don't even know why, but it was like I couldn't help it. I needed to see the place again. Needed to see if Earl was right. As I pulled up to the cemetery, it looked exactly like it had the night before. Quiet, muddy, and way too empty for my liking. And then I noticed it. There were more graves disturbed. I walked through the rows, and I could swear more of them were messed up than before. Dirt piled up in weird ways, headstones leaning like they'd been pushed, not by the rain, but from underneath. I started thinking maybe Bill wasn't doing his job right. But when I got to my dad's grave, I froze. The grave next to his, the one I'd noticed last night, was worse. The dirt wasn't just disturbed this time, it was pushed up like something was trying to get out. I'm not making this up, I swear. And those scratches on the headstone, they were deeper now, almost like claw marks. I didn't stick around to figure out what was going on. I was done with Old Hallow for the night. I didn't sleep much that night either. Surprise, surprise. It's hard to relax when you've got the image of an almost open grave burned into your brain. You know how sometimes your mind won't let go of something no matter how much you try to push it down? That was me. Lying there in my dad's old bed, staring at the ceiling, and all I could think about was that damn cemetery. I thought about what Earl had said about the ground not keeping things buried, and it gnawed at me. Part of me wanted to drive out of Ridgevale and never look back. But the other part, the part that got me into trouble every time I let my curiosity win, needed answers. So the next day, after a morning spent pretending I wasn't going to dig any deeper, no pun intended, I found myself driving back up to Old Hallow. But this time, I wasn't just there to look. I wanted to talk to Bill Harriman again. When I got to the cemetery, it was late afternoon, that weird time of day where the sun's starting to dip. But it's not quite dark yet. Everything looked gray. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground was still a mess of mud, and the sky was heavy, like it hadn't made up its mind whether it wanted to rain again or not. Bill was there, of course, moving slowly between the graves, as if he had nowhere else to be. And knowing Bill, he probably didn't. He was wiping down one of the headstones when I caught up to him, and I didn't waste any time. I asked him straight out about the disturbed graves. He didn't even flinch. Just kept polishing the stone like we were talking about the weather. "Graves settle," he muttered, not even looking at me. "Settle? This looks more like they're trying to escape," I shot back. Probably a little more sarcastic than I should have been. Bill glanced at me then, giving me one of those tired old man looks like I didn't get it. He sighed and finally stopped what he was doing. "Folks around here don't like talking about it," he said, real low. "But sometimes the dead don't stay put." I swear I felt a chill run through me when he said that. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how damn serious he sounded. I laughed it off, like I didn't believe him. But deep down, I could tell there was something in his voice that wasn't just old man talk. "Look," I said, trying to be rational. "What's really going on here? Graves don't just unearth themselves, and I've seen too many disturbed to think this is just bad luck or rain or whatever you're selling." That's when Bill stopped looking tired and started looking angry. "Maybe you shouldn't be asking questions you don't want answers to," he said, his voice cold. That caught me off guard. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I pressed him again, not really sure what I was expecting. "What do you mean by that? What's going on with the graves? And why is no one in town willing to talk about it?" Bill took a step closer, and for an old guy, he had this way of making me feel like I needed to back off. "You should go home, finish your business here, and leave Ridgevale behind. It's not your place to dig into things." Something about the way he said dig made my skin crawl, like it was more than just a figure of speech. But I wasn't ready to let it go. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening here," I said, probably more stubborn than smart. Bill just stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost like a warning. "Then come back tonight, after dark, and I'll show you." That should have been the moment I turned around and forgot the whole thing. But of course I didn't, because I'm an idiot, and, well, I had to know. So I went back to the house and waited. As soon as it got dark, I drove back up to Old Hallow. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I mean, who was I going to tell anyway? He'd probably just laugh and tell me I was in over my head. The cemetery looked different at night, more alive somehow. The headstones seemed taller, and the trees around the edges cast long, jagged shadows over everything. It wasn't raining, but the ground was still wet and muddy. There was that thick fog again, hanging low over the graves like it was waiting for something. Bill was already there when I pulled up, standing in the middle of the cemetery like he'd been expecting me. "Come on," he said, motioning for me to follow him deeper into the cemetery. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, or maybe I just couldn't walk away at that point. But I followed. We walked in silence for a while, winding between the rows of graves, until we reached the far end of the cemetery where the older graves were. That's when I saw it. The graves weren't just disturbed, they were open. A whole row of them. The earth around each one looked like it had been churned up from underneath, and in the faint light of Bill's lantern, I could see that some of the coffins weren't even fully covered anymore. "What the hell?" I muttered, stepping closer. Bill didn't say anything. He just watched as I knelt down next to one of the graves and saw the truth for myself. There was something in that coffin. A body, but not a dead one. No, this guy had been buried alive. I wish I could tell you I reacted like a normal person when I saw that body, that I freaked out and ran, called the cops or something, but I didn't. No, I just sat there, staring into that open grave, trying to process what the hell I was looking at. And trust me, it took a minute. The guy in the coffin, he wasn't moving, but I could tell from the way his body was twisted that he hadn't been dead when they put him down there. His fingers were curled, digging into the lining of the coffin like he'd been clawing at it, trying to get out. His face was frozen in this awful expression, a mix of terror and pain. I'll never forget it, the way his mouth was open, like he'd been screaming, but no one had heard him. Bill was standing there, watching me like he was waiting for me to figure it out on my own. And when I finally looked up at him, I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Why? That's all that came out. It wasn't even a question, really. More like a word I couldn't help but spit out because my brain was spinning in circles. Bill sighed, like he was tired of the whole thing, like he'd explained it a million times before. "You ever wonder why Ridgevale never just died off like all the other old mining towns around here?" he asked, his voice low and calm, like we were having a normal conversation. I didn't respond, because honestly, I'd never really thought about it. Ridgevale was a ghost town, sure, but somehow it was still there, hanging on by a thread, like a place that should have been forgotten but wasn't. "People like him," Bill said, nodding toward the open grave. "They're the reason." I stood up, wiping the dirt off my hands, but I didn't feel any cleaner. "What the hell are you talking about, Bill?" He didn't look at me when he answered, just kept staring at the graves. "This town's been dying for as long as I've been alive," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it never quite dies, you know, and that's because we make sure it doesn't. We keep it alive by putting people in the ground who deserve to stay there." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was he seriously telling me that people were being buried alive to keep the town going? "That's insane," I muttered, taking a step back, trying to put some distance between me and this whole nightmare. "You can't be serious." Bill finally looked at me then, and there was something in his eyes that scared the crap out of me. Not because he was angry or crazy, but because he genuinely believed every word he was saying. "It's not about being fair, kid," he said, his tone almost sympathetic. "It's about survival. Ridgevale's a dying town, and we do what we have to do to keep it breathing. Sometimes the ground needs more than bodies. It needs people who've done wrong. People who won't be missed." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't wrap my head around it. It was like some messed up horror movie plot, except it was happening right in front of me. "So, you just bury people alive?" I asked, not really sure I wanted the answer. Bill shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Not just anyone, only the ones who deserve it. The ones who can't be trusted, or the ones who start asking too many questions." There it was. That was the real reason I was standing in that cemetery, staring at an open grave with a dead man who had been alive when they put him down there. I was asking too many questions, and Bill wasn't the only one involved. Before I could process what was happening, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there they were. 3 other people, walking toward us in the dim light of Bill's lantern. I recognized them immediately. The mayor, the funeral director, and the sheriff. All of them looking at me like I was a problem they had to deal with. I knew right then and there that this wasn't just Bill's twisted idea of justice. This was the whole town. The mayor was the first to speak. "Jake, you should have left this alone," he said, shaking his head like I'd disappointed him. "Your father knew when to stop. That's why he stayed out of it." I felt my stomach turn. but not because of fear. No, this was something different. My dad knew about this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The mayor nodded, almost apologetically. He didn't agree with it, but he didn't fight it either. He knew that Ridgevale needed to survive, and sometimes that means making sacrifices. Sacrifices. That word hit me like a hammer. I realized then that my dad hadn't just been sitting on the sidelines, ignoring what was happening. He'd known, and he'd done nothing. He'd let it happen. And when my mom got too close to the truth, she found out, didn't she? I asked, already knowing the answer. The sheriff stepped forward, his face hard, no trace of remorse. She did, and that's why she's in the ground now, just like you're gonna be if you don't walk away. I looked back at Bill, hoping to see some kind of hesitation, some sign that maybe he wasn't as far gone as the rest of them. But I found nothing. Bill just stood there, calm as ever, waiting. And I realized I wasn't just in over my head, I was in the grave already. They were giving me a choice, shut up and leave, or end up buried alive like the rest of them. The ground around us was quiet, but I swear I could feel it. Waiting. I don't know what snapped in me at that moment, but something clicked, and I knew I wasn't walking away from this quietly. I wasn't about to let them bury me, literally or figuratively. My whole life, I'd walked away from things. Ridgevale, my family, everything. But not this time. Not with these people staring at me like I was already 6 feet under. I took a deep breath and did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't wait for Bill or the others to make a move. I just bolted, pushing past them, slipping on the wet ground and heading straight for the cemetery gates. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. My shoes were caked in mud, my legs burning from the effort, but I wasn't stopping. I knew if I did, I'd end up in one of those graves, clawing at the dirt like the poor bastard I'd seen earlier. Somehow, I made it to the car. I threw myself in, fumbling with the keys, heart racing, hands shaking, half expecting Bill to come lunging at me out of the darkness. But the car started, and I peeled out of there, leaving Old Hallow and its cursed graves behind me. The rain had started again, coming down in thick sheets, but I didn't care. I drove like a madman, desperate to get as far from that cemetery as possible. But here's the thing about small towns like Ridgevale, you don't just drive away from them, they stick to you. Like mud on your boots, like memories you can't wash off. By the time I made it back to the house, I realized it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I sat in the driveway for a while, staring out at the rain, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. I couldn't stay in Ridgevale, that much was clear. But I couldn't just leave either, not with what I knew. Not with the bodies still being put into the ground, one shovel full of dirt at a time. The house was dark when I walked inside, and it didn't feel like home. Not that it ever really had. I grabbed a few things, just the essentials, clothes, cash, anything I could carry. I was done with this place, with Ridgevale, with Old Hallow, with everything my dad had kept buried. But as I was heading for the door, something stopped me. I looked down at the coffee table and saw it, an old dusty envelope with my name on it. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, sitting there like it had been waiting for me this whole time. I hesitated for a second, then tore it open. The letter inside was in my dad's handwriting, short and to the point. Jake, if you're reading this, you've probably already figured it out. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop it. Neither could your mother. But you can still get out. Don't let them pull you under. Leave this place and don't come back. I sat there a long time, just holding that letter, trying to make sense of it all. My dad had known. He'd known everything. And he'd done nothing to stop it. Just like he'd done nothing to stop them from taking my mom. I could have been angry, I guess. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of all the secrets. Tired of Ridgevale's bullshit. And that's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to let them bury me. I wasn't going to be like my dad. I called the cops. Well, the state police, not Ridgevale's sheriff. I told them everything. What I'd seen at the cemetery, the graves, the bodies, Bill and the others. I didn't know if they'd believe me, but I didn't care. I was done with Ridgevale's secrets. I was done with all of it. It took them a few days to get someone out there. In the meantime, I packed up what little I had and left Ridgevale for good. I never looked back. I didn't want to know what they found when they started digging through the cemetery. Part of me hopes they found something. Something that would blow the whole thing wide open and bring down Bill and the rest of them. But another part of me, it hopes they never find anything. Because some things, some secrets, are better left buried. I've been gone from Ridgevale for a while now, but it still feels like it's with me. You know? Like it never really let go. I keep having these dreams. I'm back in Old Hallows, standing over that grave, watching the dirt move, waiting for someone to crawl out. And when I wake up, I swear there's mud on my hands. But here's the thing. I can't shake the feeling that Ridgevale isn't done with me. Maybe it never will be. Maybe it's not the kind of place you can leave behind. Not really. I haven't gone back, and I don't plan to. But sometimes late at night, when it's raining and the world feels quiet, I swear I can hear something. Something like digging. And I wonder if someday, Ridgevale's going to come looking for me. And this time, I'm not sure I'll be able to outrun it. You know how people say, I woke up on the wrong side of the bed? Yeah, well, that morning, it felt like I woke up on the wrong side of the universe. It was a regular Tuesday, or at least I thought it was. I rolled out of bed, still half asleep, and shuffled into the bathroom like I always did. Nothing felt off at first. I brushed my teeth, splashed some water on my face, and stared at myself in the mirror. Just your typical morning routine, right? But then I noticed something weird. Megan's hairbrush, the one she's had for years, was blue instead of pink. I stood there for a second, trying to figure it out. Maybe she got a new one? No big deal, I thought. But it was enough to make me pause. That feeling you get when you know something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? Yeah, that was creeping in slowly. Anyway, I shook it off, went downstairs, and grabbed a cup of coffee. Megan was already sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone like she usually did. Nothing strange about that, except she was humming, and Megan never hums, like ever. I asked her, "What's with the new brush?" And she looked at me like I'd asked her why the sky was blue. She didn't know what I was talking about. "I've always had this brush," she said, and I just nodded, figuring I must have been mistaken. I didn't think much of it. Not yet, anyway. Lily came downstairs next, rushing past me, late for school as usual. But when she kissed Megan on the cheek and not me, something inside me sank a little. Lily was always my little girl, you know? We had this routine where she'd give me a quick hug before bolting out the door. That morning, nothing. I called out, "Hey, no love for your old man?" And she just smiled awkwardly before running out. That's when it started to really bother me. The little things. Tiny details that felt just off. I drove to work like usual, trying to convince myself I was overthinking. It's easy to do that when life feels like it's on autopilot, you know? Same commute, same people, same everything. Except when I got to school, I swear my parking spot had moved. It sounds stupid, but it threw me off. And I noticed Tom, the guy I've been teaching next to for years, was acting different too. Like he was too friendly. You ever meet someone who's always been a bit of a jerk, but suddenly they're all smiles and compliments? That was Tom that day. I couldn't shake how unnatural it felt. Lunch came around, and I sat down with the usual group. Except this time, Shelley, the art teacher, was sitting next to me instead of across the table like she always did. I tried to make a joke about it, something like, "Switching it up today?" But she just gave me this confused look. "I always sit here," she said. And I didn't argue. Maybe I was remembering it wrong. But by the time I got home, I was really starting to feel like something was wrong. Megan didn't notice anything, of course. She was the same. Or maybe not. She mentioned some barbecue we were supposed to go to that weekend, but I had no memory of it. I mean, usually I'd know about these things, right? But she was adamant, said we talked about it for weeks. I didn't remember it at all. That night, it rained. The kind of rain that makes everything feel slower, like the world's been put on pause. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain hit the windows, thinking about all those little things from the day. Part of me was wondering if I was just going crazy, or if I was missing something obvious. I don't know. I finally drifted off around midnight. And when I woke up the next morning, things got even weirder. The rain was still falling, but the house felt different. Megan's hair wasn't just a little different this time, it was completely different. Blonde? She'd been a brunette since the day I met her. I didn't even ask her about it. I just went downstairs, grabbed my coffee, and stared at the pictures on the wall. There was one of the three of us, me, Megan, and Lily, from a vacation we'd taken a few years ago. Except in this picture, we were wearing different clothes than I remembered. And the backdrop wasn't the beach, it was the mountains. That's when I realized, every time I went to sleep, I was waking up in a slightly different version of my life, and it was only getting worse. You ever have one of those dreams where everything feels so real that when you wake up, it takes a minute to remind yourself it was just a dream? Well, that's how it started to feel. Except I wasn't waking up. Each day, things were just wrong. And not in any big dramatic way. At least not at first. It was all the little stuff. Stuff that, honestly, most people probably wouldn't even notice. But when you live with someone for years, when you've been in the same routines, you notice. That morning, after the whole Megan's blonde now thing, I decided to just keep my head down. Go to work, keep things normal, or as normal as they could be. I mean, what was I gonna do? Tell her, hey babe, why's your hair a completely different color day? Yeah, right. I'd sound like a lunatic, or worse, like I wasn't paying attention before. And trust me, that's a road you don't want to go down. But it was more than just her hair. Everything was off. The house felt like a version of itself from a parallel universe. Little things kept popping up. The couch was on the other side of the living room, a painting I'd never seen hung in the hallway, and I found a set of keys in my jacket that didn't belong to either of our cars. I stared at them for a solid minute, just trying to figure out what the hell they were for. But I tossed them on the counter and left. Maybe they were for something I'd forgotten about. I don't know. At this point, I was second-guessing everything. The drive to work wasn't much better. There was a billboard for some restaurant I swear I'd never seen before, and it was on a stretch of road I took every day. My whole body was telling me I'd never seen it, but what was I supposed to do? Pull over and argue with myself? At school, things were okay at first. For a while, I almost convinced myself everything was fine. But then, during lunch, Tom, remember him? The guy who's always been kind of a jerk? He sat down next to me, which was weird enough. But then he starts talking about some softball league we'd supposedly played in together years ago. And here's the thing. I hate softball. Like, absolutely hate it. So why would I have been in some league with him? I nodded along like I remembered, but inside, I was freaking out. I don't play sports. I've never been the kind of guy to hang out with a bunch of dudes drinking beer and talking about batting averages. But Tom's there, talking like we were best buds back in the day. And he wasn't the only one. A couple of the other teachers chimed in, laughing about how I always struck out. It felt like everyone knew some version of me that didn't exist, or at least didn't exist in the life I remembered. On my way home, the rain was coming down again. I could barely see the road through the wipers, and the streetlights were just a blur. But my mind was stuck on everything that had happened during the day. It was like I was living in a version of my life where I didn't belong. But everyone else thought I did. When I got home, Megan was sitting at the table, same as always, but something about her felt colder. I don't know how to explain it, but she wasn't the warm, playful woman I knew. There was this distance, like we'd been through something I couldn't remember. And then she mentioned it again. That barbecue we were supposed to go to, the one I had no memory of. She was talking like it was a done deal, something we'd been planning for weeks, but I couldn't remember any of it, not a single detail. And that's when I started to feel it, the cracks, the tiny, invisible fractures in my life. Things were shifting, and I was the only one noticing. I tried to act normal, tried to pretend like I wasn't losing it, but every time I went to sleep, I woke up to something new, something different. One night, I found myself standing in front of our bedroom mirror, staring at my reflection like it was a stranger. I didn't look different, at least not on the surface. But I felt different. It was like I was fading, or like I was slipping into some alternate version of myself where I didn't belong. I was still me, but the edges of my life were blurring, shifting with every sleep. And the worst part? No one else seemed to notice. Not Megan, not Lily, not the people at work. To them, I was the same old Ethan, but I wasn't. I wasn't at all. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the rain hit the windows again, wondering if I'd even recognize my life when I woke up the next day. I didn't want to sleep anymore. That's the crazy part. You wouldn't think something like that would even cross your mind, right? Everyone needs sleep. But for me, every time I closed my eyes, my life rewrote itself a little more, and I was slipping further away from the world I knew. That night, after lying in bed for what felt like hours, I finally dozed off. I didn't want to, but my body gave in. And when I woke up, man, this one threw me. Everything looked normal at first. The rain had finally stopped, the air felt damp, and there was that post-storm quiet outside that always comes after a long night of downpour. But then, as I went downstairs, I noticed Megan wasn't there. Not at the table with her usual coffee, not humming, not anywhere. I checked the kitchen, the living room, nothing. I figured maybe she'd gone out for a morning walk or run an errand. But then I called her phone, and some guy answered. I nearly dropped mine when I heard this stranger's voice saying, "Hello," like he had any business picking up her phone. "Who is this?" I demanded, probably more aggressively than I should have. The guy was calm, too calm, and he said something that made my skin crawl. "This is Dr. Worth. Who's this?" Dr. Worth? I had no idea who this person was, and why the hell would he have Megan's phone? I pressed him for details, but he just repeated, "Dr. Worth," and asked if I was feeling all right. Something about his tone sent shivers through me. It was like he was waiting for me to figure something out that I didn't even know I was supposed to be looking for. I hung up and went into full panic mode, tearing through the house, calling Megan's name, but there was nothing. I grabbed my car keys and raced out the door, hoping I'd find her somewhere, anywhere, doing something normal. Something that made sense. But as I drove through the neighborhood, it hit me. Everything around me was different. It wasn't obvious at first, but as I took the same turns I always did, the streets didn't look right. There were houses that weren't there before. The grocery store had a new sign. The gas station on the corner was now a coffee shop. I pulled over, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. It was like the whole world had shifted just enough to be noticeable, but not enough for anyone else to think it was strange. And then I remembered that name, Dr. Worth. Who was this guy? Why was he answering Megan's phone? Something about it felt too deliberate, too connected to everything else that had been going wrong. So, I drove to the school. It seemed like the only place that hadn't completely flipped upside down. Or at least I hoped. But when I pulled into the parking lot, I realized that hope was pretty much useless. The school was still there, all right, but instead of the regular kids hanging out by the entrance, there were security guards, actual security guards with uniforms and everything. It wasn't a high school anymore. It was a private academy. I parked and sat in the car, staring at the building. I could see Tom walking inside, and for a second I considered going after him, asking him what the hell was going on. But something told me it wasn't worth it. Tom wouldn't remember me now. Not this version of Tom. Hell, I wasn't even sure he was the same Tom from yesterday, or the day before that. So I did what any person would do when their entire world starts falling apart. I Googled Dr. Worth. And believe it or not, there he was. Dr. Alice Worth, sleep specialist and neurologist, based right here in town. I must have sat there staring at her photo for a good 5 minutes before I actually worked up the nerve to call the number listed on the website. It was the same voice I'd heard earlier. But this time, I introduced myself. "Dr. Worth," I said, "I need to talk to you about my wife, Megan." There was this long pause, like the guy on the other end wasn't sure what to say. And then he hit me with it. "Ethan, I am Megan." My brain couldn't even process it. It was like my entire mind just stopped. I hung up without saying another word, and stared at the phone like it had betrayed me. What was happening to my life? How could this be real? When I got home, it was late, almost evening, and the house was still empty. The rain had started again. Of course, it had. I poured myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, trying to piece everything together, trying to make sense of it all. But I couldn't. Not even close. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard the front door open. and in walked Dr. Alice Worth. Except, she looked exactly like Megan. "Hey, Hon," she said, dropping her keys on the counter like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't know what to say. I just stared at her, at this woman who looked and sounded like my wife, but whose entire existence was wrong. And the scariest part? She didn't even notice. I wish I could tell you I handled that moment with some kind of dignity, that I calmly sat down and asked this woman, this stranger, what the hell was going on. But the truth? I froze. I couldn't wrap my head around it. This person, this Dr. Alice Worth, looked exactly like Megan, moved like her, spoke like her, but she wasn't her. She couldn't be. I'd seen the website. I'd heard the voice on the phone. My Megan didn't exist in this version of my life. And that's when it hit me. I didn't know what version of my life I was even in anymore. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, walking over to me, her brow furrowed with concern. "You look off." Yeah, no kidding. I probably looked like I'd just seen someone rise from the dead. I didn't respond at first, just kind of nodded, hoping that would buy me some time to think. She, or whoever she was, sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same one Megan always sat at. She smiled at me, that familiar smile, like nothing was wrong, like everything was just fine. "How was work?" she asked, casual as ever, flipping through a magazine. I just sat there, staring at her. The rain outside picked up again, tapping against the window, filling the silence between us. I thought about saying something, anything to break the tension, but what was I supposed to say? "Hey, by the way, you're not real?" Yeah, that wasn't happening. So I just went along with it, pretended like everything was fine. I went through the motions, nodding, answering her questions, eating dinner like I wasn't completely losing my mind. Part of me hoped I'd wake up the next day and everything would be back to normal. But that was just wishful thinking. And deep down, I knew it. That night, lying in bed next to her, next to this person who wasn't my wife, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. What if I woke up tomorrow and things were even worse? What if I kept shifting further and further from the life I knew until there was nothing left of the world I remembered? I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain, just trying to keep my eyes open. But sleep has a way of creeping up on you, and eventually I drifted off. When I woke up, it was still dark outside. For a second, I thought maybe I'd woken up too early, but then I looked around and realized I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was in some kind of hospital room. White walls, sterile smell, the whole deal. My heart stopped. This wasn't right. This wasn't where I was supposed to be. I sat up in bed, pulling at the scratchy sheets, and that's when I saw him. A man sitting in the corner, watching me. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him right away. His face was shadowed by the dim light from the hallway, but I could see enough to know something was wrong. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky, even though I was trying to sound tough. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, unblinking, like he was trying to figure out what to do with me. Finally, he leaned forward, letting the light hit his face, and that's when I saw it. His face. His face was mine. Not just similar, identical. It was like staring into a twisted mirror, seeing a version of myself that wasn't quite right. His eyes were darker, colder, and there was a scar running down his cheek that I didn't have. But it was me. Somehow, this guy was me. A different version, but still me. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and calm, like he'd had this conversation a million times before. "You're jumping, slipping between lives, and it's screwing everything up." I didn't know how to respond. I mean, what do you say to yourself? What the hell is happening? I managed to get out, my voice barely above a whisper. The other me, this scarred, twisted version of me, stood up and walked over to the side of the bed. He leaned in close, and I could smell the faintest hint of smoke on him, like he'd been standing next to a fire. "You're not the only one," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "There are hundreds of us, thousands, all the different versions of you, different choices, different lives, and every time you sleep, you cross over, you take someone else's place." I wanted to scream, to tell him to shut up, that none of this made any sense. But the way he was looking at me, I knew he wasn't lying. It made too much sense. All the changes, the little differences. Every time I went to sleep, I was waking up in another life, another version of my life. But why? I asked, almost pleading now. Why is this happening? He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating. Like he knew something I didn't. Because you shouldn't exist, he said simply. You're a mistake, a glitch, and you're running out of time. You've got to make a choice, Ethan. Stay in one life, settle in, or else... Or else what? He didn't answer. He just stood there for a moment, staring at me, before turning and walking out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the dark, with the rain still pattering against the window. I wanted to chase after him, to demand answers, but my body wouldn't move. I felt trapped, like my own limbs were betraying me. And then, slowly, the world around me started to fade, like I was slipping out of it, falling into another life. And just before everything went dark, I heard his voice again, echoing in my head. Pick a life, Ethan, or it'll pick you. When I woke up, Megan was standing over me, shaking me gently. You okay? She asked, looking genuinely worried. I nodded, even though everything inside me was screaming that nothing was okay, and nothing ever would be again. I woke up to rain again. No surprise there. It had been raining for days, maybe weeks, maybe forever. By now, it felt like the rain was the only constant in my life. The same gentle tapping against the windows every morning, the same gray clouds hanging low in the sky. But that morning, I didn't care about the rain. What mattered was whether I'd wake up to the right life this time. I opened my eyes, half expecting to find myself in some other strange version of my house. But no, it was the same room, the same bed, and Megan was next to me. She was asleep, her blonde hair fanned out on the pillow like I'd seen 1,000 times. Or maybe only a few times. I couldn't tell anymore. For a minute, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd finally snapped out of whatever nightmare I'd been trapped in. Maybe I'd woken up in the life I was supposed to be in. Maybe the other me, the scarred one, was wrong. Maybe I didn't need to make a choice at all. But then I saw it, my journal, sitting on the nightstand. The journal I'd been keeping since this whole mess started, filled with notes about all the changes, the little things I couldn't explain. Except now, it was blank, completely empty, like nothing had ever happened, like the shifts had never started. That's when I knew. I wasn't done. Not yet. I got up, careful not to wake Megan, and made my way downstairs. The house was quiet, except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I poured myself a cup of coffee, just like I always did, and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd had so many normal mornings. But this morning was different. I could feel it. I sat there, sipping my coffee, staring at the blank journal, trying to figure out what my next move was. I had to make a choice, right? That's what the other me had said. Pick a life, settle in, or risk losing everything. But how was I supposed to know which life was the right one? How was I supposed to know if I was even in the right one now? The rain outside started to pick up, heavier than before. It was almost soothing, like the world was trying to lull me into a false sense of security. But I knew better. I knew I wasn't safe. Not yet. Megan came downstairs after a while, moving through the kitchen like it was any other morning. She smiled at me, the same smile I'd seen 1,000 times. Or maybe only a few. You're up early, she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from me. Everything okay? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her that everything was fine, that we were fine. But the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if this was the life I was supposed to be living. I didn't know if she was the real Megan, or just another version of her, like all the others. I didn't know if this was the last time I'd see her, or if I'd wake up tomorrow to a completely different life, where she didn't exist at all. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. I'm fine, just thinking. She nodded, sipping her coffee, completely unaware of the storm that was raging inside me, completely unaware that I'd been slipping in and out of different lives for what felt like weeks now, each one pulling me further away from the world I knew. And that's when it hit me. Maybe I wasn't supposed to choose. Maybe there was no right life. Maybe this was the life I'd been given. And it was up to me to make the best of it. The other me had said I was a mistake, a glitch, but maybe he was wrong. Maybe this was exactly where I was supposed to be. Maybe the shifts had been trying to show me something, or maybe they were just random, senseless chaos. Either way, it didn't matter. I had to make a decision, and I had to make it now. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. Megan looked up from her coffee, confused. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Just out for a bit," I said, trying to sound casual. "I need to clear my head." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Okay, just be careful, all right?" "I will," I promised, but I didn't know if I was telling the truth. I didn't know if I'd be coming back. I stepped outside, the rain pouring down harder now, soaking through my clothes almost instantly. I didn't care. I walked to my car, climbed in, and just sat there for a minute, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. This was it. This was the moment. I had to make a choice. I could keep slipping, keep jumping between lives until I lost myself completely, or I could choose to stay. I didn't know what the right answer was. I didn't know if there even was a right answer. But as I sat there, drenched in rain, staring out at the gray, foggy world, I realized something. No matter what life I woke up in tomorrow, it would still be mine. The choices would still be mine. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt calm. Not because I had all the answers, but because I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need to know if this was the right life. I just needed to live it. As I pulled out of the driveway, the rain still falling in sheets, I knew I might wake up tomorrow in another version of my life. But for now, this was the life I had, and that had to be enough. And maybe that's all any of us can ever really hope for. I guess you could say it all started when Rachel and I moved into Brookvale Heights, a place that had all the charm of an IKEA showroom and none of the warmth. You know the type. Brand new complex, glossy ads promising luxury living, but when you actually get inside, it feels like the soul's been sucked out of it before the paint even dried. We weren't picky though. After a rough year, we just wanted a fresh start, and the price was too good to pass up. Plus, the landlord, Mr. Gat Hawthorne, was practically bending over backward to get us in, offering discounts like he was trying to offload a used car nobody wanted. Rachel loved the place right away. I mean, who wouldn't? At first glance, big windows, granite countertops, that new paint smell. It had all the trimmings to make you feel like you were finally getting somewhere in life. But right off the bat, something about the place bugged me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly. Just a vibe, you know? The walls felt too thin, like you could hear more than you were supposed to from the neighbors. And not in the, hey, they're playing loud music kind of way. More like whispers that you're pretty sure shouldn't be there at all. Rachel didn't notice, or if she did, she shrugged it off like I was being paranoid. To be fair, I wasn't exactly in the best headspace at the time, and I could see why she'd think I was just overthinking things. But then, there was that first night. The rain had started falling just as we were finishing unpacking, which should have been kind of relaxing, right? I always loved the sound of rain. But that night, it felt like it was pushing us in, like the building itself was swallowing us whole. I remember lying there, listening to the rain tapping on the window. Rachel had already crashed, dead to the world, while I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard it for the first time. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't seem like they belonged to any of the neighbors we'd met that day. I brushed it off. New place? Probably just getting used to the sounds, maybe an old pipe creaking or whatever, but that didn't make it any easier to sleep. The next morning, Rachel was all sunshine and positivity, talking about what furniture we still needed and making plans for the weekend. I didn't mention the footsteps. Figured I was just being jumpy and didn't want to sound like I was already regretting the move. A couple of days later, we met one of the neighbors. An older lady named Mrs. Donahue. Seemed sweet at first, kind of like your typical grandma type, always smiling. But as soon as Rachel walked ahead of me, Mrs. Donahue leaned in and whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. She said, "Don't let the walls see you, dear. They remember things." Now I don't know about you, but that's not exactly the kind of advice I want to hear from my new neighbor. I kind of laughed it off, thinking she was just a little off her rocker, but Rachel shot me a look. She didn't hear what Mrs. Donahue said, but she could tell something was weird about it. Still, we didn't dwell on it. We had other things to worry about, like figuring out where to put our bookshelf, or why the oven kept making that weird clicking sound. But then we found the door. It was behind a cabinet in the hallway. Just this small, wooden door, painted over like someone didn't want it to exist. At first, we didn't even notice it, until Rachel tried to push the cabinet back against the wall and it wouldn't budge. So we moved it, and there it was. Locked, of course, with no key anywhere to be found. Rachel thought it was just part of the old structure, maybe some storage space that got closed off during the renovations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. And that night, as the rain fell again, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I heard the footsteps again too, only this time, they didn't just pass by, they stopped outside our door. It didn't take long for things to get weirder. After we found that strange door, Rachel's mood shifted a bit. At first, it was small stuff. She got a little more irritable, snapping at me over the tiniest things. Like I'd forget to put the cap on the toothpaste, and she'd act like I'd just burned the house down. Which, isn't exactly unusual in relationships. People get stressed, they have bad days, but this wasn't like her. And it wasn't just her temper. It was the way she'd get quiet sometimes, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I started chalking it up to the stress of the move. Maybe work was getting to her or something. But there was this one night when the rain was pouring harder than usual. We were sitting on the couch, trying to relax, and she suddenly asked, "Do you ever feel like the walls are watching us?" Now, I don't know about you, but that's not normal "let's watch a movie" conversation. I looked at her, waiting for her to laugh it off like she was joking, but she just stared at me, dead serious. I tried to play it cool. "Nah, I'm pretty sure they've got better things to do," I said, grinning like an idiot. But she didn't smile. Instead, she looked past me, straight at the wall like she was waiting for it to move or something. I couldn't help but think about what Mrs. Donahue had said, but I wasn't about to bring that up again. The next day, things got worse. Rachel wasn't just snapping at me anymore. She started talking to herself. I'd catch her mumbling in the kitchen, talking about being punished or they won't stop. I'd ask her what she meant, but she'd just look at me like I'd interrupted her in the middle of something important. Then, just as quickly, she'd snap back to normal, acting like nothing had happened. That's when I started noticing the neighbors too. You know how I said the walls were thin? Well, I started hearing things I couldn't ignore. The woman who lived next door, who I barely ever saw, had started counting. Not just regular counting either. She'd count the floor tiles in the hallway over and over again, her voice droning on like she'd forgotten how to stop. And the guy upstairs? I swear, he must have been pacing around his apartment all night, every night. Non-stop footsteps above us like he couldn't rest. I mentioned it to Rachel, thinking maybe she'd noticed it too, but she just shrugged. "They're probably stressed like us," she said, though her voice sounded far off, distracted. At this point, I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. So I called my buddy Greg, who I hadn't seen in a while, but he had this weird knack for figuring out stuff like this. He was an architect or something. I didn't really understand what he did, but he knew buildings better than anyone I knew. I asked him to come over, just to check the place out, maybe give me some peace of mind. Greg showed up the next evening, right when the rain started again, because apparently, Brookvale Heights had decided it was only going to rain at night from now on. I didn't think much of it, but Greg noticed something weird right away. "This layout's strange, man," he said, running his hand along the walls like he could feel something I couldn't. "It's like they built this place on top of something else and tried to cover it up." I'm not gonna lie, that sent a shiver through me. I hadn't told Greg anything about the asylum yet. I figured he'd just think I was nuts. But now, hearing him say that, it made my stomach drop. That night, after Greg left, I did some digging online, and I found it. Brookvale Heights was built right on top of an old psychiatric asylum. Brookvale Asylum, to be exact. Shut down in the 1960s after some, well, let's just say some unfortunate events. There were rumors, too, whispers about experiments, about people who were kept there that shouldn't have been. The more I read, the worse it got. and the name that kept popping up was Dr. Gabriel Markov, the head psychiatrist. Apparently he was notorious for trying out all kinds of weird treatments, shock therapy, isolation, you name it. But there were also stories about him conducting other experiments, stuff that didn't make it into any official report. I didn't know what to do with the information. I mean, what was I going to say to Rachel? Hey, Han. By the way, our new home is built on an old insane asylum where they used to torture people. Yeah, no. That conversation wasn't going to happen. But as the rain beat against the window that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in way over our heads. And I couldn't help but wonder, was Rachel just stressed, or was something else happening to her? Something that had been buried here long before we ever moved in? I heard those footsteps again. This time they didn't stop outside our door. So, now that I knew Brookvale Heights was sitting on top of an old asylum, things started clicking into place. But honestly, I still didn't want to believe it. I mean, come on, that's the kind of thing you read about in bad horror movies, right? Real life isn't supposed to work like that. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination run wild. But then Rachel started getting worse, and it became impossible to ignore. One night, she woke me up in the middle of the night, standing at the foot of the bed. Just standing there, in the dark, staring at me. I called her name, and she didn't respond for a long time. Then she mumbled something about being punished again, like she wasn't really talking to me, more like she was talking to someone else in the room. Only, there was no one else there. It freaked me out, but what could I do? I couldn't just leave her. This was Rachel, the person I loved. The next morning, she didn't remember any of it, at all. She laughed when I told her and said I must have been dreaming. But I wasn't, and I knew it. That same day, Greg called me. He'd been thinking about what he saw when he came over, and he wanted to dig into the history of the building. He told me to meet him at a local library where he could get access to old city records. I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending my afternoon in a dusty old library, but I had to know more. We met up in the evening, just as the rain started falling again. Because of course it did. Seemed like the universe was determined to set the mood for this whole nightmare. Greg was already buried in some old files when I got there. He waved me over, looking like he'd just found something huge. And boy, did he ever. Turns out, the asylum wasn't just shut down because of bad conditions. No, it was closed after a series of mysterious deaths. And by mysterious, I mean nasty. Patients had started dying under strange circumstances, and no one could figure out why. Officially, the cause of death was natural, but the reports Greg found hinted at something way more sinister. And at the center of it all, good old Dr. Markov. The guy was a real piece of work. He wasn't just treating patients, he was conducting experiments, messing with people's minds, trying to keep them in a state of madness, even after death. Something about preserving their mental states, whatever that means. It was all vague, but creepy as hell. And the thing that made it worse? There were rumors that Markov had never actually left the asylum. He just disappeared when it shut down. No one knew where he went, or if he even died. At this point, I was officially freaking out, but I couldn't let Rachel see it. She was already on edge, and if she knew half of what I'd found out, I wasn't sure how she'd handle it. So, I played it cool. As cool as I could anyway, given that I was pretty much living in what was clearly a haunted nightmare zone. When I got home, the building felt off, like it had a pulse or something, humming beneath the surface. I can't explain it, but I swear, the place felt different. I tried to push it out of my mind, focused on finding a way to help Rachel. Maybe if I could get us out of here for a while, she'd snap out of whatever weird funk she was in. But it wasn't that simple. That night, while I was lying in bed, listening to the rain again, I heard something from behind the cabinet in the hallway. Remember the small door we found? The one that was locked? Yeah, it sounded like something was coming from behind it. I got up, careful not to wake Rachel, and went to check it out. The sound was soft at first, like scratching. Then it got louder. Something, or someone, was behind that door, trying to get out. I grabbed a flashlight and kneeled down in front of it, trying to see if there was a way to open it without making too much noise. And that's when I saw the keyhole. I hadn't noticed it before, but now that I was looking closely, it was definitely there. Only problem, no key. I was just about to give up and head back to bed when Rachel suddenly appeared behind me. Scared the crap out of me. She was just standing there, watching me like she knew something I didn't. I asked her what she was doing, and all she said was, "We're not supposed to open that." Then she walked back to bed like nothing had happened. I stood there for a minute, staring at the door. Part of me wanted to break it down right then and there, just to see what was behind it. But the look on Rachel's face stopped me. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. That scratching noise, it never really stopped. The next day, I made up my mind. I needed to figure out what was behind that door, and I wasn't going to wait any longer. I called Greg, told him I was done playing detective and needed to see what was down there. He agreed to come by that night with some tools to help get the door open. But as the rain started falling again, and I waited for Greg to show up, Rachel came into the living room, looking more pale than I'd ever seen her. She stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity, and then said, "He's coming. You should have left when you had the chance." I didn't know who she meant by he, but I was about to find out. I waited for Greg, trying to act like Rachel's creepy little announcement didn't get to me. But I'll be real with you, I was starting to feel like I was in way over my head. Rachel had been off for days, maybe even weeks now, and I kept telling myself it was just stress, just a phase. But the way she looked at me earlier, like she wasn't even her anymore, that rattled me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't long before Greg showed up, soaked from the rain, and carrying a duffel bag full of tools, like he was on some kind of rescue mission. We didn't waste time on small talk. I led him straight to the hallway where the door was, and we got to work trying to get it open. Rachel had holed herself up in the bedroom, mumbling again about punishment or treatment. Honestly, I couldn't keep track anymore. Greg could tell something was up, but I didn't fill him in on the details. I just wanted to get through that door. It took us longer than I expected, but eventually Greg managed to pry the thing open. Behind it, a staircase. A dark, narrow staircase leading down into what had to be the original basement of the asylum. It wasn't on any floor plan I'd seen, but there it was, clear as day. And let me tell you, it smelled like the past, damp, musty, like it hadn't seen daylight in decades. Greg looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. This was a terrible idea. But at this point, I wasn't turning back. Not with Rachel getting worse by the hour. So, we grabbed our flashlights, and down we went, one step at a time, the air getting colder the deeper we went. The basement? It was worse than I could have imagined. It was like stepping into another world, one that had been forgotten, but never really left. Old medical equipment was scattered around, rusted gurneys, broken wheelchairs, and what looked like electroshock machines straight out of a horror flick. The walls were lined with old records, file cabinets spilling papers like they were still waiting for someone to come back and sort them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the cells. Yeah, you heard me right. There were actual cells down there, like little prison cells with bars and all. And inside one of them, a skeleton, still strapped to a chair in the middle of what looked like a makeshift treatment room. The skull was tilted to the side, and the bones were draped in what was left of a lab coat. Greg didn't need to say it, but I knew what he was thinking. Dr. Markov never left this place. He died down here, and from the looks of it, he'd been conducting one last experiment on himself. We were both frozen for a minute, just taking it in, when suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed through the basement. Not ours, either. It was like someone was walking just behind us, keeping pace. Greg spun around, his flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing. Just shadows. And then we heard the whispers. I swear it was like they were coming from all around us, voices I couldn't understand but somehow knew were angry, desperate. Greg looked at me, clearly spooked, and said, "We need to get out of here, man. This is bad." But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Something down here had its claws in Rachel, and I was determined to figure out what. I told Greg I'd be right behind him and made my way deeper into the basement. That's when I found the room. At the far end of the basement was a large, sealed-off room that looked like it had been used for some kind of therapy sessions. But it wasn't the equipment that caught my attention. It was the carvings on the walls. Strange symbols like something out of an occult manual, etched deep into the concrete. In the middle of the room, there was this old, dust-covered machine. It looked like some kind of electroshock setup, but it was bigger, more complex. And strapped to the chair in front of it, another skeleton. But this one wasn't alone. I'm not making this up. The room felt alive, like the air itself was watching me. And as I looked closer, I realized something horrifying. The carvings? They weren't just random scratches. They were records, treatments, dates, and patient numbers, all scrawled into the walls like a twisted diary. And at the center of it all was Markov's name, over and over, as if he'd been documenting his own madness. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some haunted basement. This was where Markov had tried to keep his patients alive, in their minds. And whatever he did, it worked. The people living in the apartment complex, they were acting out the behaviors of the patients who had died here. Rachel, Mrs. Donahue, the guy pacing upstairs. They weren't just losing it, they were becoming the people who had been locked away down here. I could hear Greg shouting for me from the stairs, telling me to hurry up. But as I stood there, staring at the skeleton in that chair, I could hear the whispers getting louder. And they weren't just angry anymore. They were calling my name. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Greg, and we bolted back up those stairs, not stopping until we slammed the door shut behind us. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was happening in that basement, it was seeping into the building, into the people. And Rachel? She was next in line. When we got back upstairs, the rain was pounding harder than ever, like it was trying to break through the windows. I stood there, catching my breath, and Greg just looked at me wide-eyed, like he was waiting for me to explain what the hell we had just seen down there. But what was I supposed to say? That the place was haunted? That the spirits of dead patients were taking over the people who lived here? It sounded insane, and I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But deep down, I knew something was horribly wrong, and whatever it was, it had Rachel in its grip. Speaking of Rachel, when I walked into the bedroom, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, completely still, staring at the wall. It was like she hadn't moved since I left. I called her name, trying to snap her out of it, but she didn't respond. That same strange look was in her eyes, like she wasn't really there anymore. Like she was just an empty shell, waiting for something, or someone else to fill her up. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her gently. "Rachel, come on, we need to get out of here," I said, trying to sound calm, even though I was anything but. But instead of responding, she looked at me with this eerie calm and said, "It's too late. He's already here." Now, if that doesn't send you into a full-blown panic, I don't know what will. But I didn't have time to process it, because right then, the lights started flickering. I mean, really flickering, like they were struggling to stay on. And the whole building felt like it was humming, vibrating with this low, deep sound that seemed to come from the very foundation. Greg burst into the room, clearly freaked out, and shouted, "We need to go now." I didn't argue. I scooped Rachel up, and we made a break for the front door. But the second we stepped into the hallway, it was like we hit a wall of noise. That's when I heard them. Footsteps. Dozens of them, all around us, coming from every direction. And not just footsteps, whispers, shuffling, doors creaking open and shut. It felt like the whole building had come alive, and not in a good way. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel them. The patients. It was like their presence was pressing in on me from all sides, crowding the hallway. Greg kept shouting something about the basement, about the carvings on the walls and the weird machine we'd seen, but I could barely hear him over the noise. And Rachel? She wasn't making a sound. She just kept staring straight ahead, like she was seeing something we couldn't. That's when I realized what I had to do. I had to destroy it. The basement, the machines, whatever the hell was down there, keeping those spirits tied to this place. I had to get rid of it. I told Greg to take Rachel and get out of the building. At first he argued, but one look at Rachel and he knew I was serious. He grabbed her by the arm and headed for the stairwell, while I ran back toward the hallway where the small door was. The rain was still coming down hard, and by the time I made it to the basement entrance, the whole building felt like it was going to collapse. The humming had turned into this deep, bone-rattling vibration, and the air was thick with static, like something was building up, about to snap. I knew I didn't have much time. I ran down the stairs, my flashlight bouncing off the walls, and headed straight for the large room at the back. The one with the carvings and the machine. It was all still there, untouched, like it had been waiting for me. Without thinking, I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a piece of metal from one of the broken gurneys, and smashed it against the machine. The sound it made was deafening, but I didn't stop. I kept hitting it, again and again, until sparks started flying and the thing was reduced to a pile of smoking parts. For a second, I thought it worked. The humming stopped and everything went quiet. But then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in pressure, but I felt it, and then I heard it. A voice, low, guttural, whispering from the shadows. "You shouldn't have done that." I turned around, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It looked like a man, but there was something wrong about him. His face was too pale, his eyes too dark, and he was wearing what looked like an old doctor's coat, stained and tattered. It didn't take a genius to figure out who it was. Dr. Markov. I froze, completely unsure of what to do next. I mean, how do you fight a ghost, right? He just stood there, staring at me with those dark, hollow eyes, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. "They were mine," he whispered, his voice echoing off the walls. "They're still mine." I didn't wait for him to finish. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, an old lantern, and threw it at the pile of machinery I'd just smashed. The thing went up in flames instantly, like it had been soaked in gasoline, and the fire spread fast, climbing up the walls and catching onto the old wooden beams. Markov didn't move. He just watched as the fire roared around us, his expression never changing. "You think you've won," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "But you can't destroy what's already been lost." I didn't stick around to find out what he meant. I bolted up the stairs, the flames chasing me the whole way. By the time I made it to the front door, the entire building was starting to go up in flames. Greg was standing there, holding Rachel, watching in stunned silence as the fire consumed Brookville Heights. We didn't say a word. We just stood there in the rain, watching the place burn. And even though I knew we were safe, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out. Something that wasn't done with us yet. Rachel never really came back from it. She's quiet now, distant, like she left a part of herself in that building. And me? Well, I still hear the footsteps sometimes, late at night, when the rain's falling just right. Like they're waiting for someone to open that door again. So, I guess I should start with how this all began. You know, the part where I thought life was just trying to screw me over, but it turned out it had much bigger plans than that. It was right after the divorce, and I wasn't exactly in the best place. Tommy, my 6-year-old, was taking it better than me. He's always been the strong one, the kid who smiles even when things are falling apart around him. And I figured moving back to my old childhood home would help us both settle in again. That place had been sitting empty for years, and I never imagined I'd be the one to fill it again. But here we were, lugging boxes up the porch steps in the rain. Classic scene, right? Cold drizzle, evening setting in, and me just trying to avoid slipping on the wet concrete. Tommy was already talking about how excited he was to explore the house, and I could hear him chattering on about his adventures as he ran ahead. You know how kids are, their imaginations run wild, and you just kind of smile and nod, hoping it keeps them busy while you unpack. But things started feeling strange pretty quickly. And I don't mean spooky old house strange. I mean like, something's off, but I can't put my finger on it, strange. At first, it was little stuff, like I'd set down a box in the kitchen, turn around, and the thing would be halfway across the room. Or Tommy would ask me where I put one of his toys, and I'd swear I hadn't even touched it. And yeah, I get it. Moving's chaotic. You forget where things are. But it wasn't just the toys. Tommy started talking about this new friend he had, a kid named Oscar, and I thought, okay, imaginary friend, no big deal. Divorce is hard. Kids cope however they can, right? But this Oscar, man, he was different. I could tell right away. Tommy would go on and on about him like he was real. Like he wasn't just some figment of his imagination, but an actual kid. He'd say things like, Oscar doesn't like it when we leave the house, or Oscar says we should stay here forever, and I'd just laugh it off, until I couldn't. One night, after we'd been there about a week, I overheard Tommy talking in his room. I figured he was just playing around, making up stories like usual, but this time, it sounded like an actual conversation. Like, there were pauses, like he was waiting for someone to respond. I went to his door, and yeah, he was sitting there on the floor, facing the corner, nodding like he was agreeing with someone. When I asked him what he was doing, he just looked up at me with this totally innocent expression and said, Oscar says he doesn't like when you interrupt. I laughed it off, but inside, part of me thought, okay, this is getting weird. The next day, I found one of Tommy's toys, a little action figure, at the top of the stairs. Now, I swear I'd put it in his room the night before. So how did it end up there? It didn't make sense. I started asking Tommy if he was playing tricks on me, but he just looked confused, like he didn't understand what I was talking about. And that's when things started ramping up. Like, I'd hear footsteps at night, but only when it was raining. It was always after Tommy had gone to bed, and I knew for sure it wasn't him because I'd check. It was these light, almost playful footsteps running down the hallway. I'd get up thinking I'd catch him out of bed, but every time I looked, nothing. Just the sound of rain against the windows and empty halls. I remember one evening, I was sitting on the couch, trying to relax with a beer, and Tommy came up to me with this serious look on his face. You know, the kind of look that 6-year-olds shouldn't have. And he said, Oscar told me to tell you that you shouldn't have left us. He says you'll regret it. Now, I don't know about you, but that sent a chill right through me. I laughed, sure, because what else do you do when your kid says something creepy like that, right? But I couldn't shake it. That night, I lay in bed just listening to the rain, wondering if I'd made a mistake coming back here. Wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to Tommy's friend than I wanted to believe. And that's when things really started going sideways. Things didn't get better after that night. In fact, they got a whole lot weirder. I mean, I wasn't losing my mind or anything, but I was starting to wonder if Tommy was messing with me. You know, kids can be tricky, and maybe all this Oscar talk was just his way of getting attention. But part of me, the part that had lived in that house as a kid, was starting to remember things I'd forgotten. Or maybe I'd blocked them out. It was raining again, because of course it was. And Tommy was in his room, chattering away with Oscar like they were best friends. I was downstairs trying to focus on work, but the sound of his little voice just kept pulling me out of it. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a crash. Not a little thud, but a full-on crash, like something big had fallen over. I bolted upstairs, expecting to find Tommy had knocked over a bookshelf or something. But when I opened the door, he was just sitting there, playing with his toys, not a care in the world. And everything in his room was perfectly fine. No mess, no sign that anything had fallen. I asked him if he'd heard the noise, and he just shrugged, like it was no big deal. Oscar's mad at you, he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I tried to laugh it off again, but something in his voice made it hard to do that. There was just something about the way he said it that didn't sit right with me. I don't know, call it father's intuition, but it felt wrong. So I went back downstairs, but I couldn't focus on anything. I just kept thinking about that noise and about how Tommy had said Oscar was mad. And then, things started happening around the house. Little things. At first, I'd leave the TV remote on the couch, turn around, and it'd be on the kitchen table. Or I'd put my keys by the front door, and 5 minutes later, they'd be in the bathroom sink. I figured I was just distracted, maybe stressed out from the move and the divorce, but then it escalated. One night, Tommy came running downstairs, clearly shaken. He said Oscar had told him not to go into the basement. Now, I hadn't even mentioned the basement to him because it was a mess. Old storage boxes, cobwebs, the usual junk. But the fact that Tommy was suddenly scared of it was odd. He'd never been afraid of anything before. I asked him why Oscar didn't want him down there, and Tommy looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and said, Because that's where it happened. That's where what happened? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to dig through the dusty basement to find out. Not yet, anyway. Then the neighbor's dog died. Now, normally I wouldn't think much of that, except Tommy had mentioned to me that Oscar didn't like the dog. And not just in passing, he had actually said, Oscar wants that dog to go away. It was a weird thing for a 6-year-old to say, but I didn't think much of it at the time. But when the dog turned up dead the next day, it stuck with me. The thing is, Tommy didn't seem surprised. In fact, he didn't even react when I told him, just shrugged and said, Oscar didn't like him. And that was it. Like, end of conversation. I brought it up to Sarah, his mom, figuring maybe she'd noticed something off about Tommy during his weekends with her. But she just brushed it off as kid stuff, said I was overreacting, which, to be fair, I probably was. But still, something about it wasn't sitting right. That's when Mark got involved. Now, Mark's an old friend of mine, one of those guys who's always around, even when you're not sure you want him to be. He came by one night for dinner, rain pouring down as usual, and the second he walked in, Tommy looked at him and said, Oscar doesn't like you. Mark laughed it off, of course, like anyone would, but the whole evening felt, I don't know, tense. I mean, I wasn't imagining it. Every time Mark tried to talk to Tommy, the kid would just glare at him, and I could swear the temperature dropped a few degrees whenever Mark said something that Oscar didn't agree with. And then, when Mark left that night, he got into a car accident. Nothing major, just a fender bender. But it shook him up enough to call me as soon as it happened. It was the weirdest thing, he said. I swerved out of nowhere, like something pushed me off the road. He laughed, but I could tell he was freaked out. I didn't tell him what Tommy had said. I didn't want to freak him out more than he already was. But part of me, okay, most of me, was starting to think this whole Oscar thing wasn't just in Tommy's head. You ever get that feeling like everything's adding up to something you don't really want to face? Yeah, that's exactly where I was at. Alright, so this is where things started to go from weird to what the hell is happening. After Mark's little accident, I couldn't stop thinking about how Tommy seemed to predict it. It was one thing for him to have an imaginary friend, but this Oscar, whoever or whatever he was starting to feel a little too real for my liking. So I did what any curious, slightly freaked out guy would do. I started digging. I figured the house had been empty for years, so maybe there was something in the old storage boxes that would give me some answers. My parents had lived there before me, and I remember them being super protective of certain parts of the house, especially the basement. And for whatever reason, I hadn't spent much time down there as a kid. I guess I'd always felt like it wasn't my space, like I wasn't supposed to be down there. Which, looking back, should have been a red flag in itself. So, one rainy evening, I waited until Tommy had fallen asleep, because I sure as hell wasn't going to drag him into this, and I went into the basement. You know the deal. Old boxes, dusty shelves, the kind of stuff you find in any basement. But one box in particular caught my eye. It was tucked away behind some old furniture, and it had my mom's handwriting on it. Her maiden name, actually, which struck me as odd. I hadn't thought about my mom's side of the family in years, not since she passed. But something about that box felt important. I dragged it upstairs, pried it open, and found a bunch of old photos, letters, and, most interesting of all, an old journal. My mom's journal, to be exact. I wasn't sure I should read it. I mean, no one wants to go through their parents' personal stuff, especially not when they're gone, but something told me I needed to. And boy, was I right about that. The entries were mostly about daily life, stuff about me as a kid, how hard it was for her after my dad died, and how she had struggled to keep things together. But then I came across an entry that mentioned something I hadn't heard in years. Oscar. Apparently, I had an imaginary friend named Oscar when I was around Tommy's age. I didn't remember him at all, but my mom sure did. According to her, I'd started talking about Oscar not long after we'd moved into the house, just like Tommy had. She wrote about how worried she'd been, because Oscar wasn't just your typical imaginary friend, he was controlling, manipulative even. And, just like with Tommy, things started happening around the house. Small accidents, strange noises, and weird coincidences. She had tried everything. taking me to therapists, moving my room around, even leaving offerings of food outside the house thinking it was some sort of spirit that needed appeasing. But it didn't stop. In fact, things got worse, and then she just stopped writing. There were no more entries after that. The journal ended abruptly, with nothing about how things had resolved or what she'd done to stop it. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. How could I have forgotten something so significant, and how could the same thing be happening to Tommy now? It felt like history was repeating itself, only this time I didn't have anyone to ask for help. My mom was gone, and my dad had died under mysterious circumstances that no one had ever really explained. I always assumed it was some freak accident, but now I wasn't so sure. The next day, I tried to bring it up with Tommy. I asked him if he knew where Oscar came from, or if Oscar had ever talked about me when I was a kid. Tommy just shrugged, like it was the most normal thing in the world, and said, "Oscar says he's always been here. He's part of the house." That line hit me like a ton of bricks, let me tell you. He's part of the house. What the hell did that even mean? I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out, but at the same time, I knew I had to. I couldn't just ignore it, not after everything I'd read in my mom's journal. That night, I called Sarah again, told her everything. I thought she'd think I was losing it, but to my surprise, she didn't blow me off this time. In fact, she sounded genuinely worried. She said Tommy had been acting strange during his weekends with her, too, talking about how Oscar didn't like when he left the house and how Oscar was always watching. We agreed that we needed to do something. But what? Neither of us had any idea how to handle a situation like this. I mean, how do you deal with an entity that might or might not be imaginary, but also seems to have the power to manipulate events in real life? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. By the time Sarah showed up at the house, I was a mess. I hadn't slept in days, and every little sound in that damn house was starting to get to me. The rain hadn't let up either. Like it was determined to stick around just to add an extra layer of misery to everything. Sarah walked in, looking about as freaked out as I felt, and I knew this wasn't just some kid phase we were dealing with anymore. We were in deep. We sat Tommy down at the kitchen table, both of us trying to keep things calm, but it didn't take long for him to catch on. You ever try to trick a 6-year-old into thinking everything's fine when it really isn't? Yeah, good luck with that. Tommy crossed his arms and gave us this look, this defiant, almost smug look, and said, "Oscar doesn't want to talk to you." I wasn't sure whether to be scared or furious. "Oscar isn't real, Tommy," I said, but the words sounded weak, even to me. And honestly, I wasn't entirely sure I believed them anymore. Tommy's face changed. It was like someone had flipped a switch. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Oscar says you don't belong here. He says you left us, and now he's going to make sure you can't leave again." Sarah glanced at me, her face pale, but she stayed quiet. We didn't know what to say, and Tommy just got up from the table, like the conversation was over. He walked up the stairs to his room, humming this little tune that made my skin crawl, and Sarah and I just sat there, staring at each other. "We have to do something," she finally whispered, her voice shaking. "This can't keep going on. He's not safe here." I nodded, but I had no idea what to do. I mean, who do you call when your kid's imaginary friend is trying to take over your life? A shrink? A priest? Ghostbusters? None of those options felt right, but I had one lead: my mom's journal. Sarah and I spent the rest of the night digging through every bit of information we could find. We went online, searching for anything: urban legends, ghost stories, old news articles about the house, but nothing seemed to fit. It was all dead ends, until we came across a name that rang a bell: Marlene Turner. She was a local spiritualist, someone who'd been around back when I was a kid, and apparently she'd had a run-in with Oscar once before. I remembered hearing about her from my mom, like some old family story that no one really believed. But desperate times, right? I tracked her down. She was still living in the area, running her little shop filled with crystals and candles and all the usual stuff you'd expect from a woman who claimed to talk to spirits. We showed up at her place, and she didn't even blink when we told her about Tommy. It was like she knew exactly what we were talking about, like she'd been waiting for us to show up. "Oscar isn't just some imaginary friend," she said, pouring us each a cup of tea like we were talking about the weather. He's a spirit tied to that house. A restless one, too. He's been there for years, attaching himself to children, using them to act out his unfinished business. I wasn't sure whether to believe her or laugh in her face, but after everything I'd seen, I wasn't about to dismiss her outright. "How do we stop him?" I asked, figuring she had some kind of magical solution, but Marlene just shook her head, like it wasn't that simple. "The house is where his power is strongest," she said. "As long as Tommy stays there, Oscar will keep feeding off him, growing stronger. You have to sever the connection." So we had a plan, or at least part of one. The problem was, we had no idea what severing the connection actually meant, or if it was even possible. But Marlene agreed to help us try. She said there was a ritual, something her grandmother had done to push Oscar away years ago, though it hadn't lasted. She warned us that Oscar would fight back, that he wouldn't just let Tommy go easily. That night, Sarah, Marlene, and I gathered in the living room, ready to give this whole thing a shot. It was raining again, of course, because why not? Tommy was upstairs, and I could hear him laughing, talking to Oscar like they were planning some kind of game. Marlene set up candles, drew symbols on the floor with chalk, and started chanting something, under her breath. It all felt a little ridiculous, like we were in some kind of bad horror movie, but I was too desperate to care. We were in the middle of the ritual when everything went to hell. The lights flickered, the rain outside turned into this steady, pounding rhythm against the windows, and Tommy's voice grew louder, almost mocking us. "Oscar doesn't want you here," Tommy shouted from upstairs, his voice sounding way too old for a 6-year-old. Marlene kept chanting, but it was like the house itself was fighting her. Doors slammed, windows rattled, and I could feel the weight of something pressing down on all of us. It wasn't just in Tommy's head anymore. Oscar was real, and he was angry. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, but I couldn't focus on anything but Tommy's voice. I could hear him stomping around upstairs like he was throwing a tantrum. But it wasn't just Tommy, it was Oscar. And he wasn't going to let go without a fight. I knew in that moment we were dealing with something way beyond our control. And whatever was going to happen next, well, we weren't prepared for it. The house felt alive that night. Not in some metaphorical, creepy way, but like it was breathing, pushing against us, daring us to make a move. Marlene's chanting picked up pace, her voice growing louder, more urgent, as if she was trying to outshout whatever was stirring up Tommy upstairs. Sarah stood next to me, gripping my arm so tightly I thought she'd leave bruises. But I didn't care. The only thing on my mind was Tommy, and whether or not we were actually going to get him out of this. And then, as if on cue, Tommy came down the stairs. But it wasn't really Tommy anymore. I mean, sure, it was his little 6-year-old body, but the way he moved, the look in his eyes, it was like someone else had taken over. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staring at us, his head tilted to the side, and with the most chilling grin I've ever seen, he said, "Oscar doesn't like this. He says you need to stop now, or else." I can't explain the feeling in the room at that moment, but it was like everything hung in the air, waiting to drop. Marlene didn't stop, though. She kept going, louder and louder, and I could see the frustration building on Tommy's, or rather Oscar's face. He took a step closer, his tiny feet making no sound on the wooden floor, and then he pointed right at me. "You left us," he said, his voice calm but full of something dark. "You thought you could just walk away, but Oscar never forgets." Sarah was trembling next to me, but I knew we couldn't stop. Whatever was happening, we had to push through it. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I called out to Tommy, hoping there was some part of him left in there. "Tommy, listen to me. This isn't you, buddy. You've got to fight this. Come back to us." For a second, just a split second, I saw a flicker in his eyes, like he recognized me. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, and he let out this awful laugh, the kind of laugh no 6-year-old should ever make. "Oscar says you'll never take me away," he sneered. "He's stronger now. He's going to stay with me forever." Marlene suddenly stood up, her chanting stopping abruptly. She looked directly at me, her face pale and drawn, and said, "You're the only one who can do this. You need to let go of your fear. Oscar feeds on it, on your guilt. If you don't cut him off, He'll keep getting stronger, and you'll lose Tommy for good. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. I'd been dragging my guilt around for years. Guilt over the divorce, over moving back here, over not being the father I thought I should be. Oscar had latched on to that, just like he'd done to me as a kid, and now he was using it to control Tommy. But how do you let go of something like that? It's not like flipping a switch. It's something that sticks to you, eats at you, until you don't even realize it's there anymore. But if I didn't figure it out, Tommy was going to be lost to this thing. So, I took a deep breath, looked straight at Tommy, or Oscar, or whatever the hell he was, and said, "You're right, I did leave, I screwed up, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Not again." For a moment nothing happened. The rain kept pounding against the windows, the lights flickered, and I could still feel that heavy, oppressive force in the room. But then, something shifted. Tommy's face twisted, like he was fighting against something inside him, and I saw it again, that flicker of recognition. "Oscar doesn't control you, Tommy," I said, my voice steady even though I didn't feel steady at all. "He's just trying to use you, but you're stronger than that. You can fight him." And then, as if those words had some kind of magic power, Tommy crumpled to the floor. He started crying, like really sobbing, and I rushed over to him, pulling him into my arms. Marlene whispered something under her breath, and the candles flickered, but the oppressive weight in the room finally lifted. The air felt lighter, the house was still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it was just us. Me, Sarah, and Tommy. Oscar was gone. At least, that's what we hoped. Marlene said the ritual had severed the connection, but she also warned us that spirits like Oscar don't just disappear forever. They wait. They bide their time, and when the conditions are right, they come back. We moved out of that house the next day. I wasn't taking any chances. We packed up our things, and I made sure Tommy didn't even say goodbye to the place. It's been a few years now, and Tommy's doing okay. He doesn't talk about Oscar anymore, and for the most part, he's back to being the happy kid I used to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain is falling just right, I'll catch him staring out the window, like he's listening to something far away. And I'll wonder just for a second if Oscar is really gone, or if he's just waiting for another chance to come back. So, I guess this all started on one of those evenings when it feels like you've already lost the day and you're just trying to make something out of it. You know the kind. Rain tapping lightly on the windows, kind of like it's just reminding you to stay inside. I had been out all day trying to find some decent shots for my portfolio, but honestly, it had been one of those miserable, uninspired days where everything looked dull. And yeah, maybe my mood wasn't helping. Photography had been rough for me lately. No big gigs, no leads, just me, my camera, and a lot of failed attempts to make a name for myself. Anyway, that's when I decided to hit up this old flea market that was still open despite the weather. I wasn't looking for anything specific, more like I was just killing time, maybe hoping something would spark some creative energy. That's when I saw it, the camera. It was sitting there, right in the middle of a table full of random junk. I don't know why I stopped, but I did. It was one of those vintage deals, black with this old, worn leather strap. The kind of camera that looks like it's seen a lot of years but still somehow works. The guy behind the table, this old man with a patchy beard and eyes that didn't quite match, saw me looking at it and gave me this slow, crooked smile. "You've got a good eye," he said. I shrugged, more out of politeness than anything. But then he went on about how the camera had a history, like it had taken special photos or something. I wasn't really listening at first. You know how those flea market types are, always trying to make their junk sound more interesting than it is. But then he said something that did make me stop. "You won't need film," he muttered, almost like he didn't mean to say it. That's when I raised an eyebrow. A camera that didn't need film? Yeah, right. But I have to admit, it got my attention. I figured, why not? Maybe it was a gimmick, maybe it was broken, but I could mess around with it. He practically gave it to me for free, told me to be careful with it as I walked away. I took it home, rain still falling outside, and figured I'd try a test shot. Just something simple, you know? My cat, Whiskers, was lounging on the windowsill, so I aimed the camera at her and clicked. The shutter sound was solid, like really satisfying, but there was no film to develop and nothing happened, so I put the camera down and went about the rest of my night. It wasn't until later, when I was about to head to bed, that I noticed Whiskers hadn't moved. I called her name, nothing. She just sat there, staring blankly out the window. Now, she was a lazy cat, no doubt, but this was weird. I walked over, nudged her gently, and she didn't even blink. I won't lie, it creeped me out a little. I mean, cats don't just freeze like that. I figured she was just tired or maybe feeling off, so I let it go, but it stuck in my mind. That strange, empty look in her eyes. Like she wasn't really there anymore. I should have seen the warning signs then. But I didn't. I just went to bed with the rain still drumming against the window. The next day, I woke up to the rain still going, but it had that heavier, steady rhythm now, like it wasn't planning to stop anytime soon. I remember feeling sluggish, one of those mornings where getting out of bed felt like a chore. When I finally dragged myself up, I noticed Whiskers was still in the same spot. Still hadn't moved. Still staring out the window with that blank expression. Now, I don't know much about cats, but even I knew that wasn't normal. I walked over and gave her a gentle nudge, and that's when I realized something was really wrong. She wasn't just being lazy, she was cold. No movement, no breathing. Nothing. I can't tell you how messed up that moment was, staring down at my dead cat and trying to figure out how the hell it happened overnight. She had been fine the day before, lounging in her usual spot, and now she was just gone. I tried to make sense of it, thinking maybe it was just some sudden illness or natural cause. She wasn't exactly young anymore, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling that it had something to do with that camera. Part of me knew it was ridiculous. There's no way taking a picture could do something like that, right? But another part of me couldn't stop replaying that moment when I clicked the shutter and how still she'd been ever since. I didn't have much time to dwell on it, though, because later that afternoon, Rachel came over. Rachel's been my best friend for years. She's one of those people who can make you laugh, even when you're in the worst mood. She showed up, soaked from the rain, grinning like an idiot as she shook off her umbrella. "Tom, you look like hell," she said, plopping down on the couch. "What's up with you?" I tried to act normal, not wanting to bring up the whole dead cat thing right away. So we chatted about random stuff, her latest Tinder date disaster, some boring work drama. You know, the usual catch-up. At some point, she noticed the camera sitting on the table, and of course, wanted to know all about it. "Is that thing vintage?" she asked, picking it up before I could even respond. "It's cool in a creepy way. Take a picture of me with it." Now I know what you're thinking. Why the hell didn't I stop her? But honestly, I was still caught between thinking the whole thing with Whiskers was a freak coincidence, or maybe just my own paranoia. I wasn't seriously believing the camera had anything to do with it, so I caved. I mean, Rachel was all excited about it, posing like an idiot in front of the window, laughing as I aimed the lens at her. "Come on, Tom, don't make me look bad," she teased, flashing one of her goofy smiles. I clicked the shutter, and for a second everything felt fine, normal. Just another random moment with Rachel being her usual self. But as soon as I lowered the camera, I noticed something off. She wasn't moving anymore. Not like Whiskers had been, frozen in place, but more like her energy just faded. She slumped down on the couch, staring at her phone, barely acknowledging me. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, trying to shake off the weirdness. Rachel shrugged, her voice suddenly dull. "Yeah, I'm just tired, I guess. I don't know, I feel weird." That's when I started to panic, but I didn't let it show. I tried to laugh it off, told her maybe the weather was getting to her, or she needed more coffee. But deep down, I couldn't stop thinking about Whiskers. How she'd gone from normal to lifeless so fast. And now Rachel was acting the same way. We hung out for a bit longer, but she wasn't herself. By the time she left, she barely even said goodbye, like she was in a daze. And I was left sitting there, staring at that damn camera, trying to convince myself I wasn't going crazy. But the rain kept falling outside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. I didn't sleep much that night. The rain kept coming down in this steady, relentless way, tapping against my window like it had something important to say. I just lay there, thinking about Whiskers and Rachel, running through every possible explanation in my head that didn't involve a cursed camera. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Seriously wrong. By the time the morning rolled around, I was half convinced I was overthinking everything. Maybe Rachel was just tired, right? People have off days, and cats, well, they die sometimes. It wasn't exactly unheard of. But part of me, the part that wasn't trying to rationalize everything, knew something was up. Something about that camera wasn't right. I called Rachel to check on her. No answer. I texted her a couple of times, trying to play it casual. Hey, you alive? Lol? But still nothing. That was weird. Rachel wasn't the type to just go silent, especially after hanging out the day before. So I waited, figuring maybe she was just sleeping in or something. Hours went by, still nothing. Around noon, I started getting this sinking feeling. Yeah, judge me if you want, but I couldn't stop thinking about that photo. About how Whiskers had been fine until I took that shot. And now Rachel. I tried calling again, and that's when I got the call. Jake, Rachel's boyfriend, sounded frantic. He asked if I'd seen her the night before and told me she was in the hospital. Apparently, she'd collapsed that morning, totally unresponsive. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Just like that, everything clicked into place in the worst possible way. I threw on a jacket and ran out into the rain, heading to the hospital, my mind racing with 100 different thoughts, none of them good. When I got there, Jake was waiting in the lobby, clearly shaken. He wasn't the emotional type, always the tough guy, but seeing him like that made it real. She's in a coma, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctors don't know what happened, she just won't wake up. I could barely wrap my head around it. Rachel, full of life and energy, now lying in some sterile hospital bed, totally lifeless. And the worst part? I knew why. At least, part of me did. That damn camera. I didn't say anything to Jake about it, though. I mean, how could I? Oh hey, by the way, I think I took a picture of your girlfriend and accidentally stole her soul. Yeah, that wasn't gonna fly. Instead, I just stood there like an idiot, pretending to be as confused as he was. But inside, I was panicking. There was no way this was a coincidence anymore. First Whiskers, now Rachel. Both right after I used that camera. There had to be something to it, some kind of connection. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the camera like it was some ticking time bomb. Rain still tapping against the windows, shadows creeping in as the light outside faded. I knew I had to figure this out, and fast, but I had no idea where to start. So I did the only thing that made sense. I went online. I spent hours searching for anything about antique cameras, soul-stealing devices, weird photography curses, you name it, I looked it up. Eventually, I stumbled across something. Some old urban legend about a photographer named Victor Hale, who lived back in the 1920s. He was famous for his eerie, lifelike photos. People said he had this way of capturing something more than just an image, like he was taking a piece of his subjects with him. As I dug deeper, the story got darker. Hale's subjects, people he'd photographed for years, had started falling into comas, just like Rachel. Some even died. There were whispers that Hale had been dabbling in the occult, trying to trap the souls of his subjects in his photos. But no one ever proved anything. He disappeared one night, taking his secrets with him. The more I read, the more convinced I became. This camera, it had to be Hale's. Somehow it ended up at that flea market, and now I was caught in the middle of something I didn't understand. The rain outside had turned into a downpour by then, hammering against the windows, like it was urging me to do something, anything. But what the hell could I do? I couldn't just march into the hospital and tell them Rachel's soul was trapped in a photo. Could I? I couldn't even bring myself to tell Jake. I was in way over my head, and I knew it. That night, I tried to destroy the camera. I smashed it against the floor, threw it against the cat wall, even took a hammer to it. But no matter what I did, it wouldn't break. It was like the damn thing was indestructible, just sitting there mocking me. The photos, too. I still had them. The one of Whiskers and the one of Rachel. They were perfect. Too perfect. Like the life had been sucked right out of them and trapped on paper. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't dealing with some ordinary camera. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. And if I didn't figure out how to stop it, Rachel wouldn't be the last. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was Jake, and the guy looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, hair a mess, eyes sunken like he'd been carrying the weight of the world. I didn't need to ask how Rachel was. I could tell from the look on his face. He stepped inside without saying much, the rain still drizzling outside like it had no plans of stopping anytime soon. We sat down, and I could feel the tension hanging between us. I knew he wanted answers, and I wasn't sure I had any that would make sense. But Jake, he wasn't the kind of guy to beat around the bush. He just came right out with it. "She's not getting better," he said, voice low, almost mechanical. "Doctors have no idea what's wrong. They're saying it's like her body's fine, but her mind's just gone. What the hell happened after you took that picture, Tom?" I froze. This was it. There was no way I could keep dodging the truth anymore. Part of me wanted to tell him it was just a coincidence, that I didn't know anything more than he did, but that would have been a lie. And after everything that had happened, I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't involved. So I told him, all of it, about Whiskers, about the camera, about Victor Hale. I laid it all out there, knowing full well it sounded insane. Hell, I felt insane even saying it. But the moment I finished, I saw it in Jake's eyes. That look. He believed me. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that Rachel's soul is trapped in a photo?" He didn't say it with disbelief. More like he was trying to piece together the puzzle in his head. "Yeah, I know how it sounds," I muttered, running my hands through my hair, feeling like a total idiot for even saying the words out loud. "But I swear on my life, man, that camera is doing something. Something messed up, and I don't know how to fix it." Jake leaned back, rubbing his jaw in that way he always did when he was thinking something over. For a second, he didn't say anything. Just stared at the floor, rain tapping against the windows like it was eavesdropping on the conversation. Then, he looked up, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. "What if there's a way to bring her back?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but there was this intensity behind it that made me sit up. "You said that photographer Hale was using the back camera to trap souls. Maybe there's a way to reverse it, a way to get her soul back into her body." I hadn't thought about that. I mean, the idea of reversing whatever curse was on the camera had crossed my mind, sure, but I had no clue how it would work. Jake, though, he had this fire in his eyes, like he wasn't willing to give up on Rachel, no matter how crazy it sounded. "How?" I asked, feeling a flicker of hope, though I wasn't sure I should be. "If the camera's taken her soul, what do we do to get it back?" Jake hesitated for a second, and that's when I realized he'd already thought this through. Maybe a little too much. "Look," he said, leaning forward, lowering his voice like he was afraid someone might hear. "I did some digging too. There's this theory that the camera demands a trade, a life for a life. If we use it to take someone else's soul, Rachel's could be freed." I just sat there, staring at him, not sure I heard him right. "You're talking about using the camera on someone else to save Rachel?" He nodded, his expression dead serious. "Tom, we don't have a choice. The doctors are saying there's no way she's coming back. This is our only shot. If we find someone who won't be missed, we could bring her back." My stomach turned at the thought, even though I tried to push it down. What Jake was suggesting wasn't just dark. It was twisted. But at the same time, I got where he was coming from. He was desperate. He loved Rachel. He'd do anything to save her. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell at him, tell him he was crazy for even thinking about it. But the other part, the part that felt responsible for what happened to Rachel in the first place, that part was considering it. "Who?" I finally asked, feeling sick just saying it. "Who are you thinking of?" Jake didn't even hesitate. He'd already planned it out. "There's a guy, homeless, always hanging around the corner of Main and 5th. No one's gonna miss him, Tom. We could use him." I sat back, staring out the window at the rain falling harder now. I couldn't believe we were actually having this conversation. But what else could I do? Let Rachel stay trapped in a coma because I wasn't willing to do something horrible to save her? The idea gnawed at me. I was at a crossroads, and both paths were dark as hell. Either I lost my best friend forever, or I did something unforgivable to save her. Jake didn't say much after that. He left me to think about it, leaving behind the weight of his plan in the air. And as the rain kept falling, I couldn't help but wonder if I was already too far gone to make the right choice. The next day, the rain hadn't let up. It was coming down in sheets, soaking the streets and making everything outside look blurred and distant. I sat by the window, staring at the camera on the table, wondering how the hell I'd ended up here. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I was just a guy trying to scrape together a photography career. And now I was considering stealing someone's soul to save Rachel's. It sounded insane, even to me, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt trapped. Jake called around noon, his voice tense, like he knew time was running out. "Did you decide?" he asked, like it was as simple as picking what to have for dinner. But it wasn't. This was life and death, and not in a metaphorical sense. I told him I needed more time, but in reality, I didn't know how much time Rachel had left. Every second felt like it was slipping away, like the rain outside, endless and unstoppable. By evening, I cracked. I couldn't handle the weight of it anymore. The thought of Rachel lying in that hospital bed, lifeless because of me, it was too much. So I called Jake and told him I was in. We were going to do it. We met up later that night, the streets almost deserted because of the rain. The homeless guy was there, just like Jake had said, huddled in a corner under an old newspaper to stay dry. He didn't even look up when we approached. I kept telling myself that Jake was right. No one would miss him. But that didn't make it any easier. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered to Jake, still hoping he might back out, that we'd find another way. But his eyes were locked on the guy like he was already committed. "It's the only way," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "We have to save Rachel." I felt sick as I raised the camera. The guy looked up just as I pressed the shutter. The click echoed through the rain, and for a moment everything was silent. He didn't collapse like I thought he would. He just froze. His eyes went blank, his body stiffened, and then he slowly slumped over, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Jake and I stood there, staring at him, neither of us saying a word. I don't know what I expected to feel. Relief, maybe, or some kind of clarity. But all I felt was this cold emptiness, like I'd just crossed a line I could never uncross. We left him there, his body still in the rain, and I couldn't bring myself to look back. The hospital was quiet when we arrived. Jake had called ahead, and they were expecting us. I still didn't know what we were hoping for. That Rachel would just magically wake up? That her soul would snap back into her body like nothing had happened? It sounded ridiculous, even as we walked down those sterile, too bright hallways. When we got to her room, she looked exactly the same as she had before. Pale, lifeless, her chest rising and falling with the help of machines. Jake rushed to her side, gripping her hand like he could pull her back through sheer willpower, but nothing changed. She stayed still, too still. "Come on," Jake whispered, his voice breaking for the first time since this whole nightmare started. "Come on, Rachel. I did it. I saved you." But she didn't respond. I could see it in his face, that flicker of hope, that tiny spark that had kept him going. It was gone. I don't know how long we stood there, waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. Eventually, Jake let go of her hand and turned to me, his face twisted with confusion and rage. "Why didn't it work?" he demanded, like I had the answer. "We did what the camera wanted. Why didn't it work?" I had no idea. Maybe we'd misunderstood how the camera worked. Maybe Rachel's soul was too far gone, or maybe the camera had played us from the start. Either way, there was nothing I could say to make it right. I'd let him lead me down this dark path, and now we were both lost. It wasn't until we were walking out of the hospital that I started to notice something. My hands, they felt numb, like the feeling was draining out of them. I tried to shake it off, but it spread, slowly up my arms, into my chest. I looked down at my reflection in the glass doors as we passed by, and for a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My eyes, they weren't mine anymore. It hit me then. The camera had never needed someone else. It had been after me this whole time. With every shot I took, it had been slowly draining me, and now it was almost finished. I didn't say anything to Jake. I didn't have the heart to tell him that after all we'd done, Rachel wasn't coming back, and neither was I. We'd both made a deal with the devil, and now we were paying for it. That night, I sat in my apartment, the rain still falling outside. The camera sat on the table, looking as ordinary as ever, but I knew better. It had taken what it wanted. My soul was next. I thought about smashing it again, but I knew it was pointless. The camera wasn't something you could just break. It was something ancient, something powerful, and it had been playing me from the start. As I sat there, waiting for whatever was coming, I thought about Rachel. I thought about Jake, and I thought about all the things I would never get to do again. I didn't have much time left. I could feel it, the numbness creeping up, taking over. The camera's last shot was me. It was a rainy Thursday evening when it all started, like one of those quiet nights where you just want to crawl under a blanket with a good book and not think too hard about anything. I was at the library, as usual, doing my thing, reshelving books and trying to make sense of the weird old filing system that had been around longer than I'd been alive. The rain was hitting the windows in that steady, rhythmic way, and most of the people who had come in earlier had already cleared out, probably to avoid getting soaked. There was this one older lady, though, Mrs. Harrison, a regular at the library. She must have been in her 80s and came in every other day to check out the same type of mystery novels. The ones with the detectives who solve everything in the last chapter like clockwork. I liked her. She had that kind of grandmotherly energy that made you feel like she'd slip you a cookie if she had any in her purse. So when she asked for a hand with reaching a book on the top shelf, I didn't hesitate. I helped her grab the book, and she thanked me with that warm smile of hers, the kind that made me feel like a good person for once. I thought that was it, you know? Just another routine moment in a sea of routine moments. But as soon as I took her hand to steady her, I heard this voice. It wasn't loud or anything. It was just there, in my head, like someone had flipped on a radio station I didn't know existed. The voice was Mrs. Harrison's, but it wasn't her speaking in front of me. It was inside me, and it was panicked. I should have told them. That's what I heard. And then just like that, she collapsed. No warning, no indication that anything was wrong, just down, right there in the middle of the mystery section. I didn't know what to do. I mean, part of me thought maybe she just fainted. Maybe it was nothing serious. But she wasn't moving, and it was clear. She was gone. The paramedics showed up after I called 911, but it didn't take long for them to confirm what I already knew. Mrs. Harrison was dead. They asked me a few questions, probably just routine stuff, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard in my head. That thought, I should have told them. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was my brain playing tricks on me. But the thing is, I knew deep down it wasn't just my imagination. That voice, that thought, it was too clear, too specific, like it was meant for me to hear. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my best friend Mark, who I usually go to with this kind of weird stuff. I mean, how do you even start that conversation? Hey, I think I heard a dead lady's last thought before she kicked it in the library. Yeah, that wasn't gonna fly. So I kept it to myself and hoped it was a one-time thing, just a glitch in the system or whatever. But then, a week later, I went to the hospital to visit my mom. She wasn't doing too well, early, signs of dementia, and every visit felt like another step toward watching her disappear. It was raining that day too, which felt fitting somehow. The kind of rain that makes you want to sit still and reflect on all the crap life throws your way. I was sitting by her bed, holding her hand, talking to her about nothing in particular, when it happened again. I heard her voice. Not the one coming out of her mouth, but the one in my head. I can't remember what I was supposed to say. That's what she was thinking. She hadn't even finished speaking out loud when her breathing got all shallow, and just like that, she was gone too. I can't even explain how surreal it felt. It wasn't just losing her, though that was bad enough. It was the fact that I had heard her final thought, like it was some kind of sick message delivered straight into my brain. I told the nurse right away, and they did what they could, but it was too late, same as it had been with Mrs. Harrison. I went home that night, soaked from the rain, trying to make sense of everything. 2 people, 2 final thoughts I shouldn't have been able to hear, but I did. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't over. I tried my best to shake it off, pretend like everything was fine, like I wasn't hearing the last thoughts of people right before they died. But that's the kind of thing that sticks with you. Every time I was around someone, I'd start wondering what their final thought might be, whether I'd hear it in my head just before they dropped dead in front of me. It was a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. I stopped visiting my mom's grave after a while because, honestly, I didn't want to think about it anymore. It was raining the last time I went. Surprise, surprise, and all I could think about was that stupid voice in my head. So a couple of weeks later, I decided to get back to normal, or at least pretend to. I went for a jog at the park like I used to, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. It was one of those overcast evenings, right after it rained, when everything smells damp and earthy, but there's still a hint of that cool breeze that makes it all bearable. It was quiet, just me, a couple of joggers, and a guy walking his dog. No big deal, right? Well, I was wrong. Again, I was coming around this bend in the trail, and I must have not been paying attention because I accidentally bumped into this guy with the dog. He was a big dude, looked like the type who spent more time at the gym than I did reading books, but he didn't seem pissed or anything. I apologized, made some awkward joke about my terrible coordination, and was about to keep jogging when it happened. "She's gonna kill me." The voice hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some random thought either. It was dark, scared, like the kind of thought you don't expect to hear. I glanced at the guy, and he looked fine, totally normal. But then he just collapsed, right there in the middle of the park, his dog still standing next to him, wagging its tail like nothing was wrong. I didn't know what to do. Part of me thought, oh great, it's happening again. But another part of me just froze because, let's be real, what are you supposed to do in a situation like that? I knelt down beside him, hoping maybe he was just knocked out or something. But I knew before the paramedics even showed up that this guy wasn't getting back up. I called 911 and waited with his dog, feeling the rain start to drizzle down again, making the whole scene even more miserable than it already was. The paramedics confirmed what I already knew. He was dead. And just like before, I was the last person to hear his final thought, "She's going to kill me." That thought stuck with me, though. Who was she? Why was he afraid of her? It didn't make sense, and I wasn't about to ignore it this time. I couldn't. Not when it felt like there was something more going on, something I had to understand. So I did what I usually do when things get weird. I called Mark. Mark was always the guy I went to when I needed to vent, or when something was too messed up for me to deal with on my own. He was a former cop, turned private investigator, and had this way of making everything seem less terrifying, even if it was completely out of control. I met up with him at a diner that evening, and it was still raining, of course. I told him about what happened in the park, about hearing the guy's final thought, and how this wasn't the first time it had happened. Mark listened, didn't interrupt me once, which is rare for him. When I was done, he leaned back, took a sip of his coffee, and said, "You're hearing dead people's last thoughts? That's one hell of a problem, man. You think this is going to keep happening?" I shrugged, because honestly, I had no idea. "I don't know, but it's already happened 3 times. I feel like there's something more to it. This last guy," he said, "she's going to kill me. What if it wasn't just random?" Mark didn't laugh or brush it off, which I appreciated. He just nodded, like he was already running through all the angles in his head. "So what do you want to do? You want me to look into this guy?" I didn't even have to think about it. I nodded, because I knew I couldn't let it go. "Yeah, I think we need to know who she is." And what the hell is going on? Mark pulled out his phone and made a few calls while I sat there, staring out the diner window as the rain kept falling. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random fluke. There was something bigger, something darker happening. And I was right in the middle of it, whether I wanted to be or not. Mark got some info on the guy. Lucas was his name. Apparently, he'd recently filed for divorce and had a restraining order against his ex-wife, Marissa. That's when things started to click into place. Maybe this wasn't some weird supernatural coincidence. Maybe it was something real, something dangerous. Mark and I agreed to meet up the next day to dig deeper, and as I walked home in the rain, I couldn't shake the voice in my head. She's gonna kill me. Whoever she was, I had a feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For ChatGPT Puijo, ChatGPT Chapter 3, The Trap. So the next day, Mark and I started digging into Lucas's life. We figured if his last thought was about someone killing him, we should probably take it seriously. And trust me, it didn't take long to realize there was something off about this whole situation. Lucas's ex-wife, Marissa, was a piece of work. She wasn't just your average ex. She had a reputation around town, the kind of reputation where people stop talking when her name comes up. Mark pulled up a bunch of files on her. Nothing too shocking at first, just the usual drama that comes with a messy divorce, restraining orders, court hearings, the works. But there was one thing that caught my attention. Lucas had told the court that Marissa had threatened him, but the police never found enough evidence to press charges. Classic case of he said, she said stuff. But after hearing that guy's final thought, I knew there was more to it. We found out she had this secluded cabin, way out in the woods. Lucas had mentioned it in one of his restraining order requests. Said she liked to take him there to talk things through, which already sounded sketchy as hell. I wasn't exactly thrilled about heading out into the middle of nowhere, but Mark was all about getting to the bottom of things, and honestly, I didn't have much of a choice. I needed to know if Marissa was behind all of this, so that evening, we drove out to the cabin. It was raining, of course, because apparently, the universe was set on making every part of this ordeal as gloomy as possible. The drive out there was long, winding, and way too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you rethink your life choices. I remember glancing over at Mark, who seemed completely unfazed by the whole thing. I guess being a PI meant he'd seen worse, but I wasn't exactly used to investigating potential murderers in the middle of the woods. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt like we were stepping into a scene from a horror movie. The place was run down, overgrown with weeds, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb on the front porch. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a sane person to live. We parked a little way down the road, didn't want to spook her if she was inside, and made our way up to the front door. The whole time I kept hearing Lucas's final thought in my head, like a broken record. She's going to kill me. It wasn't just that I heard it. It felt like a warning, like we were walking straight into something we shouldn't be. Mark knocked on the door, and we waited. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. Part of me was relieved. Maybe she wasn't home. Maybe we could just turn around and call it a day. But then Mark, being the stubborn guy he is, tried the door handle. It was unlocked. "Looks like we're going in," he said, pushing the door open like it was the most normal thing in the world. I followed him inside, even though every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get the hell out of there. The inside of the cabin was worse than the outside. Dusty, dark, and cluttered with old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But what caught my attention were the photos. Everywhere you looked, there were photos pinned to the walls, spread across tables, taped to mirrors. And they weren't just random pictures. They were pictures of Lucas, taken at different times, in different places. And in every single one, he looked different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. But the more I looked, the more I noticed he seemed scared in each photo, more and more unsettled as time went on, like he knew something was coming for him, but he couldn't stop it. "Jesus, man, look at this," Mark muttered, picking up one of the photos. She was watching him. "This is messed up." He was right. This wasn't just an ex keeping tabs on her ex-husband. This was full-on stalking, obsessive, and creepy as hell. That's when we found the journal. It was sitting on the table in the center of the room, and I could tell right away that it was Marissa's. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost clinical, and the first page was filled with notes about Lucas. How he betrayed her, how he deserved what was coming, and how the ritual was nearly complete. Ritual? What the hell did that mean? Before we had time to process it, we heard a car pull up outside. Mark's eyes widened, and we both moved fast, hiding behind an old bookshelf just as the door creaked open. Marissa walked in, but she wasn't alone. A tall man, someone I didn't recognize, was with her, and they were talking in low voices. I could barely make out what they were saying, but the words sacrifice and it's done stood out like a beacon. Mark and I exchanged looks, both of us realizing at the same time that this wasn't just a messy divorce situation. This was something else. Something much worse. We stayed hidden, listening as they talked about the ritual, and how Lucas was just the beginning. They mentioned other names, people who were next. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I felt my stomach twist as I realized we had walked right into their trap. And now we were stuck in this cabin, with two people who were clearly planning something terrible, and we had no way of getting out without them noticing. I heard footsteps coming closer, and my mind raced, trying to figure out what we were going to do. But before I could come up with a plan, I brushed against an old scarf hanging on the side of the bookshelf. And just like that, I heard it again. A final thought, this time from someone long gone. They know everything. It hit me like a punch to the gut. We were caught. They knew we were there. I remember that moment like it was yesterday, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. The second I heard that final thought, they know everything, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just fear. I mean, yeah, I was scared, but this was something else. It was that creeping realization that we had walked right into a trap, and there was no easy way out. Marissa and this tall guy knew we were there, and I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like the rain outside. I didn't dare move. I could hear their footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to where we were hiding. Mark glanced at me, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that he was trying to figure out a way to get us out of this mess. He's always been the quick thinker, the guy who could talk his way out of anything, but this time, it felt like we were way out of our league. Marissa's voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come here, Evan." She said my name like she'd known me for years, like we were old friends or something, but the way she said it made my skin crawl. She knew exactly who I was, and she wasn't surprised that I was there. That freaked me out more than anything else. Before I could even process what was happening, Mark sprang up from behind the bookshelf, ready to confront them. "We're just here to talk," he said, trying to sound calm, even though I knew he wasn't. "You don't want to do anything stupid." Marissa just laughed, this low, unsettling sound that made it clear she wasn't buying any of it. "Oh, Mark, you're already too late. You think you can stop this? You don't even know what's going on." She wasn't wrong. We didn't have a clue, but we were about to find out. The tall guy stepped forward, and that's when I realized just how wrong everything was. This wasn't just some random dude Marissa had roped into her plans. He wasn't normal. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was enough to make me realize we were dealing with something far darker than just a messy ex-wife situation. "You've heard them, haven't you?" the guy said, looking straight at me. His voice was deep, almost hypnotic, and I swear for a second I felt like I was the one being pulled into some kind of trance. The final thoughts, "You've been hearing them, just like me." It was like someone had flipped a switch. The pieces started falling into place. This guy wasn't just part of Marissa's twisted plot. He was like me. He had the same ability, but he wasn't fighting it. He was using it, manipulating it, turning those final thoughts into something far more dangerous. I didn't know what to say. How do you respond to something like that? I mean, up until this point, I'd been trying to convince myself that what was happening to me was some freak accident, something I could shake off eventually. But hearing this guy talk about it like it was part of some grand plan, that freaked me out. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated. "You've resisted it, haven't you? Tried to ignore it. But that's not how this works, Evan. You're one of us now, whether you like it or not. Mark shifted next to me, clearly trying to figure out what the hell this guy was talking about. But I knew exactly what he meant. This wasn't just some weird fluke. This was real, and it had been passed down to me, like a curse I couldn't shake. Marissa stepped closer, her eyes locked on mine. He's right, Evan. You've been given a gift, a connection to something bigger than yourself. We've been watching you, waiting for you to join us. Join you? I managed to choke out, finally finding my voice. What are you talking about? The tall guy laughed, this low, guttural sound that echoed through the room. You think hearing the dead is some kind of curse? No, Evan, it's power. The more you listen, the more you can control it. You can harness it, use it, but you've been wasting it, resisting it. That's why we're here, to show you how it's really done. It all clicked then. Lucas wasn't just some random victim of a jealous ex-wife. He had been targeted, and now I was next. Before I could even react, Marissa moved fast, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward her. The second she touched me, I heard it. Her final thought, "It's too late." I jerked back, but it was already too late. My head was spinning, not from fear, but from the realization that I was in way over my head. Mark lunged at the tall guy, but he didn't stand a chance. The guy was faster, stronger, and before I knew it, Mark was pinned to the ground, struggling to break free. I tried to move, tried to think, but everything was happening so fast. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me, the rain pounding against the windows, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and dust. "You can stop this, Evan," the tall guy said, his voice smooth, like he was offering me the deal of a lifetime. "All you have to do is embrace it, let go of the resistance. You'll see, it's not a curse, it's freedom." Part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me was desperate for this whole nightmare to make sense. But then I saw Mark, struggling beneath the guy's grip, and I knew I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't become like them. I had to fight back. Everything in me wanted to run, to get the hell out of that cabin and never look back. But there was no running from this. Not now. Not when everything had spiraled so far out of control. Mark was pinned down, gasping for air as the tall guy held him like a puppet on strings. And Marissa was watching me with those cold, calculating eyes, waiting for me to make a move. The rain was coming down harder now, slamming against the cabin windows like it wanted in on whatever hellish ritual was about to go down. And then it hit me, like a whisper in the back of my mind, "You know how to stop him." It was my voice this time, not someone else's. My own final thought, creeping into my head like it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I knew what I had to do. I didn't want to, but I didn't have a choice. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Mark, about Lucas, about all the people who had been caught up in whatever the hell this twisted game was. I took a step forward, ignoring Marissa's smug grin. The tall guy hadn't noticed me moving yet, too focused on Mark, who was still struggling beneath him. But I knew now. I knew what had to happen, and there was no turning back. I had to embrace the curse, but not in the way they wanted. I had to turn it against them. I reached out, touching the tall guy's shoulder. The second my hand made contact, I felt it. The flood of voices, the final thoughts of every person he'd ever touched, every life he'd ever taken. They were loud, chaotic, 1,000 different whispers all clamoring for attention. But I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I could feel the power building inside me, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was controlled, deliberate, like I was the one pulling the strings now. The tall guy froze. He could feel it too. His grip on Mark loosened just enough for my friend to break free, scrambling backward, gasping for breath. I kept my hand on the tall guy's shoulder, pushing deeper, forcing him to hear the voices he'd been collecting. All those final thoughts, all that pain, it was too much for him, and I could see it in his face. His cool, controlled demeanor was cracking, like a mask peeling away to reveal the monster underneath. "You can't stop this?" he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "It's too late." But I didn't let go. I couldn't. I pushed harder, using the very thing he'd been trying to use against me. I could feel his thoughts unraveling, the power slipping away from him as the voices overtook him, drowning out whatever control he thought he had. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, trembling, his eyes wide and empty, staring at nothing. Marissa screamed, lunging at me, but Mark was quicker this time. He grabbed her, pulling her away from me, holding her back as she thrashed and cursed, spitting threats that I barely registered. I was too focused on the tall guy, watching as the life drained out of him, his final thought ringing in my head like a bell. You were stronger. And then it was over. Just like that. The tall guy was gone, his body lifeless on the floor, and the cabin fell silent, save for the sound of the rain hammering against the windows. Mark let go of Marissa, who collapsed next to the body, sobbing quietly, muttering something I couldn't make out. I didn't care anymore. Whatever she'd been part of, whatever game she'd been playing, it was done now. Mark and I didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. We just left the cabin, trudging through the rain back to his car, soaked to the bone but somehow relieved. Mark gave me a sideways glance as we drove back to town, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. But he didn't ask any questions. I think he knew better. There wasn't much left to say. The police took Marissa in, but when it came to explaining what happened, we kept it simple. The details were too insane to even try to explain. We told them about Lucas, about the photos, about how things had gotten out of hand, but I left out the part about the voices. Some things just don't belong in a police report. After that, life went back to some version of normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with this, that the voices, the final thoughts, they weren't going away anytime soon. A few weeks after everything went down, I was back at the library, shelving books like nothing had ever happened. It was raining again, like always, and the place was pretty much empty. I was in my own head, going through the motions, when a woman came up to the counter, asking for help with some obscure reference book. I smiled, doing my best to seem normal, even though the memory of that night in the cabin was still fresh in my mind. I reached out to hand her the book she needed, and the second our hands brushed, I heard it. He's still watching you. I froze, staring at her for a moment, but she didn't notice. She just thanked me and walked away, like nothing had happened. And that's when I knew. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Not for me. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. Now, the rain will continue for the next 30 minutes, a perfect time to relax and drift off. If you're still awake, no worries. You can stay with the rain or explore more scary stories on the channel. Whatever you choose, I'm glad you're here. Take your time, relax, and let the rain guide you to sleep. Until next time, stay in the shadows.